어떤 연인 것 같아. 내가 어떤 연인 것 같아. 내가 어떤 연인 것 같아. We come as one. 찬란한 순간 여기 모여 높은 곳에 가는 그리고 우리들만 안에 아주 작은 이 세계는 커져 우주를 넘어서 영원히 서로를 움직여. We come as one. We come as one. We come as one. We come as one.
Привіт всім! Звичайно, нікого не бачу там онлайн, але типу привітаюсь, раптом мене хтось буде дивитися в записі. Привітик, мене звати Мія, це мій канал Міаніма. Міаніма це канал. Ну раптом ви забули. Так, що в мене веселого? Я тут просто бавлюся. Знайшла той курс, про який я вже багато разів говорила, і вирішила його просто вімкнути, подивитися перші якісь там ознайомлювальні уроки. І побачимо, якщо воно зайде мені, то буду далі його робити. Не зайде, ну то не буду робити. Поки що просто так, розважаюсь. Привітик, я на хвильку, гарного стріму, хоношию. Дай я тебе згадаю. Дякую, що завітала. В тебе посилання на патроном не знаходиться. Блін, я не знаю чому. А, Хоші, точно. Я підозрювала, що це ти, але боялась, що я переплутала. Давно щось твій нік мені не попадався на очі. Так, а чому в мене моє посилання на Patreon не знаходиться? А якщо я ось так от візьму, ось таке посилання, воно працює чи ні? Можеш глянути, будь ласка? А чого воно? А, в мене просто рестрім не працює з якогось милого. Що за фігня? Реально рестрім треба перезавантажити, походу. Треба буде виправити собі тоді в усіх посиланнях. Дякую за інфу. Видно, це мій такий... Той, як його? Прорахувалась я, коли робила ці посилання. Якби, коли я їх встановлювала, мені допомагали їх встановлювати люди, які точно не будуть туди підписуватися, видно і не перевіряли, чи відкривається. У мене відкривається, тому що це якби посилання на мою основну сторінку, якби в мене воно завжди відкривається. Спробую так. Так, працює. Треба колись буде налаштувати ще патрон. У мене там на патроні так собі поки. Нічого цікавого не придумала. Треба буде ще це посилання виправити в цьому. Ну добре, це я потім собі подивлюся, як воно працює. Поганий я вибрала кіп-поп-плейлист, тому що він мені тільки дає приспіви пісень рандомно. Дайте мені щось цікавіше. О, вчора якийсь оновлений плейлист попався. Трохи тихенько зроблю. От так. Налаштування, глянь, може якийсь блок стоїть. Та я думаю, що все може бути. Я на патрон заходжу раз в півроку. Блін, хочу теж подібне оформлення. Яке подібне? Ти про що? Ти про мій патреон? Ти смієшся? А, стріму? Фу. Я думаю, в мене патрон реально не оформлений. Я думаю, да, оце знущання. Оформлення стріму, це ще так. Я ще працюю над ним. Ще працюю. Насправді все дуже просто. Все робиться в звичайному фотошопі із використанням доступних на стрім-елементі вільних цих шаблонів для стріму. Я їх потім просто трошки підредаговую, видаляю все, що мені не треба, і там вставляю свої заставочки. Гарного стрімчику і дня, у мене заняття починається хіх. І тобі вдалого заняття. Дякую, що зайшла, рада була бачити. Потім розкажеш детальніше, якщо я не забуду. Обов'язково, обов'язково так. А я поки що... Думаю, норм так буде мені. Ну, я тут все трошки попереставляла, собі придумала, де б ту планшет вмістити. І в мене тепер все не так, як завжди. Аж руки не знають, куди подітися. Але нічого, я ж з часом, думаю, звикну. Так, хтось тут ще є? У мене чути музику взагалі на цьому, на стрімі? Якщо нікого немає, ну ладно. Потім розберуся потрішки. Так, усе. Боже, яка я жовта, що ви мені не кажете? Побачила себе, своє відображення, і мене так перецей. Велика я. Знаєте, я так класно собі поназивала свої ці шари на цьому, на панелі. І цей, типу, де я на весь екран порівняно, називається Велика Я. Тільки що це прочитала і зрозуміла, як скріпово це звучить. О, Велика Я. Ну, типу, я просто для себе наглядно писала, що, типу, це велика вебка. Щоб довго, знаєте, не мудрувати з назвами, щоб мозку легше було сприймати, але... Ну, ржачно ж. Так, візьмемо Велику мене трошки приблизимо. Да, це круто, прям, знаєте, цікаві відчуття. Я стою якоюсь піксельною, та? Не бачу себе норм. Може менше контрасту додамо? Перестаю якось блідою. Може зробимо темніше просто. О! Прикольно, менше освітлення, краще вийшло. А тут я вже взагалі якась дуже бліда стала. Все, налаштувала камеру, чудовенько. Давненько я не виходила так швидко, так рано. Не знаю, чи я взагалі виходила так рано, насправді. Я просто цей час зазвичай витрачаю на себе. Типу я щось можу почитати, ну там, відповідно, на роботі чимось можу зайнятися. А сьогодні зранку я встала рано, і все, що треба було мені зробити, зробила, і така дивилася собі документалку, і така думаю, блін, можна ж документалку дивитися, відразу й стрімити її. Це я і собі щось корисне роблю, і людям. Але з іншого боку, потім почала в мене там документалка не повністю українською, тому що це в Україні нас же ж багатомовна спільнота людей, тобто там половина тексту все російською, я така, блін, ну, та якщо в мене будуть тут російською мовою, ну нехай. Але я не хочу так, в мене і так час від часу там максимум в якихось курсах або чомусь такому може бути російський текст. Хочеться так, щоб по максимуму використовувати можливості української мови на своїх стрімах. Поки що це трохи мене час від часу обмежує, але я поки тримаюсь і норм. Так. А тепер щодо мого прекрасного курсу, який я вирішила з вами тут пройти. Сьогодні будемо, напевно, дивитися тільки introduction, потім intro to art fundamentals. Давно я не говорила англійською. Це так стрьомненько. Ну, загалом. Спробую пройти перший модуль. Тут тупо тільки якісь вступні штуки. Це абсолютно з нуля курс по створенню персонажів. І тут починається, типу, як починати малювати. От я колись пам'ятаю, що я проходила, знаєш, там на початку, типу, якісь вправи для розвитку кисті, правильно, щоб навчитися її правильно тримати цю штуку, якою малюєш. Колись я це все робила. Мала певні успіхи, але потім забила, відповідно, 2 роки я взагалі не робила нічого з планшетом. То зараз і буду відновлювати свою моторну пам'ять, що ли. Подивлюся, що з того вийде. Так. І було б класно, якщо б мене хтось реально дивився і мені підказав потім, чи чути музику, чи вона не перебиває сам звук курсу. Бачу, що хтось це є, можливо, змилосердитись наді мною і проговорити вголос. Так, або я сама себе буду дивитися зараз, так все, як завжди. Що ще робити? Так. Та-ра-та-та-та-та-та-та. Та-ра-та-та-там. Пам-пам. Ось воно. Так, супер. Зараз спробую послухати свій курс. Де... Ага, я ж мала вімкнути цей курс. Думаю, пройшло скільки вже? Блін, 20 хвилин. Оце, блін, заспано з самого ранку. А ну-ка що? Тип-тип. Працює, не працює? Так, я сама з собою тепер бачуся. Чудово. Значить, я на зв'язку з собою. Наш початок курсу. Значить, learn how to draw people and character designs professionally. Drawing for animation, comics, cartoons, games and more. Це типу опис самого курсу. Курс буде, до речі, англійською мовою, якщо що. Подивитися, як він виглядає. Думаю, так і буду дивитися, норм. Отож. Пробуємо вмикати. Надіюсь, він тут голосно. Якщо що, вироблю кіп-попчик.
Hi and welcome to the course. My name is Scott Harris and I thought I'd do this introductory video just to kind of introduce you guys to myself, who I am, and tell you about the course, tell you how you should do the course, how you should move through the course, and also that we can kind of, even though I don't get to know you guys very well, that you get to know me and that hopefully it will be a beneficial experience for you moving through this course. So first things first, I really feel like this course is my masterwork probably of all.
Блін, що це за фігня мені завпливає саба спочатку. Я рада, що вони фартили нота такий. І як її забрати, цю ноту їхню. Я забула, де я закінчила. Коротше, my name is Scott Harris. Ще раз. О, Лана, привітик.
Just to kind of introduce you guys to myself, who I am, and tell you about the course, tell you how you should do the course, how you should move through the course, and also that we can kind of, even though I don't get to know you guys very well, that you get to know me and that hopefully it will be a beneficial experience for you moving through this course. So first things first, I really feel like this course is my masterwork probably of all the kind of course content that I've ever done. It's got so many valuable elements to it that have to do with character design and drawing characters comprehensively, drawing characters well, drawing characters appealingly. And as you move through the course, I think you're going to find that this isn't a course that you kind of, you know, you do the whole course and maybe you've had experience before, you know, you do a course and you feel like, you know, there were one or two good nuggets of information in that course. I'm hoping that you'll feel like, wow, this course really took me maybe from somewhere where you didn't know how to draw characters at all to like now I really feel like I know what I'm doing. Or if you have started drawing a bit or you're intermediate at drawing, you feel like, wow, this has amped up my skills so much. And that also that these concepts, these very core concepts, as they become part of how you draw, you feel like, wow, this course was worth it for me. That is my hope, and I really do hope, that you guys really become great character artists and are able to draw in a multitude of styles and any kinds of characters you want, with appeal, with feeling, with story, with emotion.
Що я чую? Чи я чую курс, чи що? Вам його не чути? Чи засильно голосно, чи що? Чи про що ти? А ну так я ж вчора теж закидала свої коланчики туди, щоб все склалося. Головне, щоб цей, якщо що, я не знаю, я теж в неділю буду, певно, стрімити, так що, якщо може, забіжу до тебе, можливо, і ні. Не можу точно сказати, але в курсі. Надіюсь, буде весело. Якщо що, потім подивлюсь в записі. Щоб мені коланчики не пропали дарма. Ух ти, це круто, круто. Я б теж так, знаєш, якусь собі створила як її, подію спеціально для стрімів, але поки що не можу собі це дозволити. Зараз трошки на всьому іншому зосереджена, але от я їду в Україну, наприклад, в липні, так що... Так, що ти забула? Я затикала, але ок. Добренько, продовжую я свій перегляд. Промінчик буває від мене.
And what have you. So yeah, so that's kind of how I feel about the course and how I want to kind of present the course to you. And also that the course presentation, while the theories and the concepts are going to be pretty serious in tone, I'm going to be presenting the course very much in a casual kind of way, as if I were teaching you in a class. So I don't think you need to stress about, you know, hectic theoretical studies or anything like that, but definitely I'll do my best to be as clear and concise as possible so that you're grasping the theories quickly and that you can then proceed to practice them and do exercises to kind of get them into your system and get used to them. So how I envision you guys doing the course is you watch all the videos first one time, right? You go through every single video, you watch them, you don't do any exercises, you just watch, you learn, you try to absorb, right? And then on your second run through, you go through the course and you do all the exercises. It's extremely crucial that you put in the time and the dedication to drawing out all the exercises, doing the drawings required in each of the sections. And the reason is, whilst art is definitely extremely more theoretical than people think it is, I would liken it perhaps, let's say, to playing a musical instrument. You may know everything there is to know about a guitar or a particular instrument. You may know all the theory, all the music theory, but if you don't pick up a guitar and play it, the theory's kind of useless. At the same time, using the same kind of analogy, you can realize that, you know, a lot of people will say, well, how do you get better at art? And they'll reply and they'll be like, oh, you just practice more. Well, if you could imagine yourself picking up a guitar and you just think, well, the more I keep strumming, I'm going to learn to become a better guitarist. Obviously, that's not going to happen, right? That's not the case. You're going to need the theory. So there is a duality, if you wish, or equilibrium between theory and practical when it comes to art. And hopefully this course will have you engaging comprehensively in both things. All right, I guess that's about it for the introduction to the course. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you have a good time. I hope that you definitely keep in touch with me, keep in contact with me, send me your artwork, send me your exercises as you're doing the course, and I wish you all the best. I'm very, very optimistic and hopeful that this course is going to be absolutely awesome for you. So yeah, let's get started. Enough chit chat, let's get started.
Let's get started.
Before we begin, there is something very critical I need to talk to you about, and that is this. Anybody can take a pencil or a paintbrush or a stylus and make marks. They can move their arm and they can make lines, they can make strokes. The thing here is that mastery and really achieving a high level of professionalism has a lot more to do with theory than it does with practical. Because of course, we can all make these marks, right? And so what we want to do is understand the theory to as high a level as possible so that we can make every single mark that we make effective. Now you'll be learning a lot of theory in the course, but yet the course is also packed with practical activities, practical demos, and lots of drawing to be done. And you can do this drawing traditionally using pencils and paper, or you can use Photoshop, you can use an iPad Pro with the Procreate app, or any app of your choice. The course has been filmed in Photoshop just for ease of recording, but this has no bearing on the medium that you're using. The core thing is that you grasp how critical theory is to drawing well. It's a common misconception that artists sit in coffee shops, sticking out their tongues with their moleskin sketchbooks and a cappuccino, just drawing amazingly and this talent is flowing out of them. Drawing is a skill, it's not a talent. It's a learned skill just like reading and writing. And we exist in an age today where the bulk of the population lacks this visual literacy. And I do believe that in a few hundred years, probably everyone will be able to draw well. But in our current society, we tend to give this holy honor or this sacred honor of drawing to people who we consider to be talented. I want to dispel that myth right now. It is a learned skill. Now, on that note, prepare yourself and humble yourself to learning some of the key drawing theories you need to know. And the beauty of it is, once you know them, you know them. Once you know the truth, you can't really kind of lie to yourself as you draw. So take it as an encouragement that being able to draw well relies on knowing exactly what you're doing, and that requires a lot of theory. And once again, as I've said, despite there being a lot of theory, there is also obviously a ton of practical. So I want you to get out your pencils. I want you to draw. So keep this stuff in mind as you move forward, and let's totally get you to where you want to be in terms of your drawing skills. Welcome to Let's Get Messy. And what is Let's Get Messy, right? Why am I adding this random video into the introduction section? And Let's Get Messy is really an encouragement to you to be messy, to be untidy, to be loose, to be rough when you're drawing, right? I've done this course in a way where I don't want you to feel like, wow, I could never achieve the drawings that I'm seeing in these videos. No, I haven't done the course in a way where you've got these refined, perfectly drawn examples, perfectly drawn exercises, perfectly drawn things that you feel like, well, I can't achieve this level of perfection, right? No, I've done the course in a way that is loose, that is messy, that is rough. Yet, the elements of the theory are correct, the elements of the theory are strong, and I will show you how to move from rough and messy to refined and neat and beautiful and tidied up and clean and professional work, right? But I want to encourage you, as you're starting the course, start letting go of trying to make perfect drawings, right? Start letting go of it. Be rough. When you're doing exercises, be rough. When you're trying to work things out, be rough, be loose. Let yourself be wild and free and fast, okay? Let's get messy. Let's get really messy. Think about this. A construction site is filthy, yet it's building houses, it's building buildings, it's messy. I mean, it's not filthy as in dirt, it's just filthy and it's messy, it's chaos, there's construction equipment everywhere, workers everywhere, you know, things aren't painted, finishings aren't put in. You've got to think like that. Same thing with the kitchen. You know, a good baker, a good cook, they do not operate in these pristine kitchens like you see on TV shows. They're messy and they're throwing flavors around and food around, and they're getting messy and they're getting into it and they're getting their hands dirty. And when you're building something great, you've got to get your hands dirty. And then you can use the refinement stage to make those things neat and clear and nice and beautiful and professional. Because really, professional look and professional feeling comes from solid construction, and construction is messy. So let me encourage you, let's get messy, let's get rough, let's get to the core truths of art. And then once we've got the stuff down and the solid foundations down, then we can focus on kneading it up, tidying it up, painting those buildings, icing those cakes, for a metaphor. All right, let's get messy, let's move on.
Все зрозуміленько.
Hey guys, and welcome to the Art Basics video. This is the very first video in the course, and we're just going to talk about 3 basic things in a very simple way at first, and then the next video is going to really expand your thinking of these things. So the first thing we want to talk about is shape, and what we mean when we're talking about shape. All right. Shape really refers to 2D or iconographic shapes, right? Iconographic. So really, something like this type of circle or a square, you know, anything that's kind of 2D, flat, kind of on the page, something like that, that's a shape. You know, all of these things can be shapes. These are shapes, right? The shape of things, right? The basic sort of fundamental shape of something. So even something that is 3D, let's say, for example, let's just do kind of a more of a 3D head design here. Right, that's sort of just a basic head layout. Even the design of this has a basic shape to it that the viewer will see. All right. So really just that kind of basic shape. If you shaded it in, you know, that it was flat and no longer 3D, it has that kind of shape to it. So that's what shape is, 2D shapes or iconographic shapes. even perhaps 2D is too much. They're very flat. It's almost like 1D because you really only see one side of a shape. Like a shape is just sort of a one-sided type of thing. All right. The next thing we want to look at is form, right? And what we mean by forms. Okay. So form is really 3D shapes, multiple sides. Okay, so we can see multiple sides of the object. So then we start using words like sphere, right? So we can imagine that as a ball, right? As a sphere or cube. Okay, so these are forms and so forth. And anything, we can try to turn anything into a
Чорний
form.
екран,
by
нічого
kind
не
of
видно. Зараз, секунду, зайду з іншого браузера. То я задивилася, що вам не показує. Ах, цей Google, який береже авторські права. Ай-яй-яй. Чим я тут займаюсь? Такс. На-на-на. Ну і... Як ж воно глючить? Так, який це в мене 5-й? Давайте спочатку, мабуть, так? Ну, чи воно показує, звичайно. Чи треба зрозуміти? Теж не показує. Сумно, значить, буде сумно. Я то надіялась. Ну, треба буде, значить, мені малювати. Ага, фіг там. Ну... Тихо. Що це не схоже на який поп-плейлист? Може на Ютубі є подібні безкоштовні? Та я хочу цей пройти, мені він норм. Типу. Що думаєш? Мені не світить? Та блін, ну чого ж воно норм працювало? Що за хрінь?
It in, you know, that it was first video in the course, and we're just going to talk about 3 basic things in a very simple way at first, and then the next video is going to really expand your thinking of these things. So the first thing we want to talk about is shape and what we mean when we're talking about shape. All right. Shape really refers to 2D or iconographic shapes, right? Iconographic, right? Iconographic. So really something like this type of circle or a square, you know, anything that's kind of 2D, flat, kind of on the page, something like that, that's a shape. You know, all of these things can be shapes. These are shapes, right? The shape of things, right? The basic sort of fundamental shape of something. So even something that is 3D, let's say, for example, let's just do kind of a more of a 3D head design here. Right, it's sort of just a basic head layout. Even the design of this has a basic shape to it that the viewer will see. All right. So really just that kind of basic shape. If you shaded it in, you know, that it was flat and no longer 3D, it has that kind of shape to it. So that's what shape is, 2D shapes or iconographic shapes. Even perhaps 2D is too much, they're very flat, it's almost like 1D because you really only see one side of a shape. Like
мені здається, музика трохи заголосно. Вам не перебиває звук кіп-попчику?
a shape is just sort of a one-sided type of thing. All right. The next thing we want to look at is form, right? And what we mean by forms, okay? So form is really 3D shapes, multiple sides, okay? So we can see multiple sides of the object. So then we start using words like sphere, right? So we can imagine that as a ball, right? As a sphere or a cube. Okay, so these are forms and so forth. And anything, we can try to turn anything into a form by kind of giving it multiple sides. So now I've added an ellipse to the end of this thing, and now maybe it looks like some kind of horn, right? So it's kind of got more form to it. So we can see that there are multiple sides, and these are forms. And things that generally form part of form theory is stuff like perspective, which helps us understand kind of a virtual spatial area, right? So it gives us space to build things in, and things like lighting, right? When we kind of add light and shadow to things, we're kind of indicating form. You know, for example, if we keep this side light and we put this side in shadow, the viewer can then perceive by these two planes, these two different lit planes, that this is one side and this is another side. So that is form. And then last but not least, we have this category called detail, right? And detail, for the most part, things like textures, right? Textures and material types, which basically inform the textures, material types, and things like color, right? So these things form the textures, the material types, the color, and for example, if this were our form, and we can see that this form has this shape to it, which is really something like that, okay? And we could then say, well, let's make this a stone block, and I'll add some textures to it and maybe mess up its edges a little bit so it looks more stony and rock-like. And obviously if I added a color to it, gray or what have you, that would be the detail section. Alright, so in the next video we're going to discuss this in depth, but basically this is the structure of art in many ways. We have shape at the bottom, then form, then detail. Take note of how much space each of these categories occupies on this sort of theoretical pyramid here, and it will really help you understand what the most important parts of your art are. Alright, let's deep dive this in the next video. I'll see you there. Give you some perspectives on how to see art perhaps in 3 different ways, right? So the first thing that I'm gonna kind of illustrate here is this triangle, and the triangle is made of 3 parts. It's kind of like in order of importance, right? And at the bottom we have shape, in the middle we have form, and at the top we have details. All right. And when we're talking about each of these categories, what we really want to think of is all the art theory that's related to these 3 sort of major categories of art. So shape, for example, is about composition. It's about your 2D iconographic shapes. It's about the dynamism of your shapes. It's about the read of your shapes, about silhouette and all those various elements, right? And of course, composition is extremely foundational, right? It's about the shape of your lights and so on. Form basically deals with perspective, light, and drawing in 3D in terms of, you know, are you establishing solid forms that make sense in a space, and that space is defined by perspective, right? And in terms of lighting, are you lighting objects in a way that you can see their form? So form is related to everything that gives us a perception of 3-dimensionality. And then lastly, details refers to sort of your textures, your
Зроблю паузу, я така просто намагаюсь зрозуміти, як би перекласти shape and form українською мовою, так, щоб це було зрозуміло. Ну, тому що для мене форма і форма, ну, мається на увазі в даному випадку shape – це форма для 2D, а form – це форма для 3D. Типу, що shape – це просто весь простір, ось такий, який ми бачимо, який займає між собою, але не розуміємо сторін, наприклад, а лише ось просто на 2D-малюнку. А форма – це коли ми вже маємо уявлення про те, де яка сторона, типу воно в просторі. Не просто на картинці, а в просторі. Ну, а деталі вже додають там всякі нюанси. Ось як я собі це зрозуміла. Фігура. Точно, дякую, фігура. Я намагалася зрозуміти як силует, а фігура – це просто ідеально. Точно, бачиш, який переклад ще є. Дякую. Нормас. Тепер я краще це зрозуміла.
smaller details of objects as well as the color of things. All right. So the way you kind of want to understand art theory, the way art theory is sort of structurally built, is in this shape, form, details kind of model, where shape is the most important consideration theoretically, then form, and then details. All right. But let's just take this, move it to the side here, and add another triangle. We're going to have 3 triangles, 3 different ways that you guys should think about kind of the structure of art, right? Let's put another triangle here. Actually, let's just make these a little bit smaller so we can fit the 3rd one nicely. All right. Now, the second kind of way that you want to think about art, so this is the theoretical, let's call it hierarchy. Okay, so when you're drawing, you want to be thinking about shape first, then form, then details in terms of what is structurally important to the piece. However, your implementation theory Implementation.
Так, слово implementation,
Theory.
давайте згадаю.
This is how you actually are going to work, right? How you're practically going to work. So we can just call this practical as well, right? And this is basically shape and form happening simultaneously. Sorry, mind you. Let's call it form and shape. That's because, and then lastly, this would be details, right? And the reason it's form and shape is to the viewer, and we'll do the viewer's triangle just now, but basically we need to be drawing 3D objects as realists, right? So we're doing imaginative realism, or representational art as it's called, and so everything we do needs to be three-dimensional, makes sense in time, in space, in a place with lighting, and so on, right? And so we always need forms. But we can see from the theoretical hierarchy that shape is extremely important. So we need to draw the forms, but then let shape inform the 2D shapes of the forms, so the silhouettes of those forms, right? Nevertheless, we'll get into this a little bit deeper later on in terms of when we're doing practical drawing and things like that. But it's important to know that we want to approach how we draw, like our practical side of drawing, as both form and shape happening at the same time. We're thinking about these at the same time. And then once we've got that down, then we do details, right? And the details in terms of drawing could really be the refined process. And that would be like clean lines and all the details and the nice, beautiful hairlines. And this would be your rough or your plan process, right? So here you can see kind of a little picture into the workflow of how we would draw. We do a rough and a plan, which would embody form and shape. And then the refined drawing on top would draw on those forms and shapes that we've done, adding the details to them. And then we'd have a nice completed drawing. Okay. So just a way to think about it, right? This is our theoretical hierarchy. This is our implementation theory, and implementation hierarchy, if you wish. We start with form and shape, and then we do details. And actually, let me just really clarify this. The details are always a lot simpler to do once you've got a solid foundation. So I think a lot of beginner artists especially, they will worry about the details very much, but this is kind of how we want to kind of weight our work when it comes to actually doing the practical side of drawing, right? Lots of work on the forms and the shapes, and then you don't need that much work on the details to finish up. Although ironically, as a side note, this is really the 80-20 rule. So they say 80% of the work takes 20% of the time to do. So you can see 80% of the work here is form and shape. It's only going to take 20% of the time to do. And conversely, the details, even though they're sort of 20% of like the thought and the theory, they're going to...
Ну, тож я на днях дивилася інший стрім, і там якраз ми говорили про те, що новачкам взагалі краще не вдаватися в деталі, відразу типу не збільшувати, коли ви починаєте малювати, тому що ви дуже довго будете деталі робити. І головне, типу, працювати в першу чергу над формою. От, типу, форми, фігури. Боже, як добре, що гмик є і мені допоміг це слово якось аудіювати. Тому що мені, типу, коли ти розумієш, а не пам'ятаєш слова, це дуже, дуже фігово. І І якраз тут про те ж саме йдеться, що насправді в деталях треба найменше працювати. Але, ну, типу, якщо, судячи з мого досвіду, коли я там малювала щось взагалі без якогось туторіалу, просто пробувала щось малювати, в мене завжди тупо зависаєш на деталях. Аніме деталі виконало взагалі і норм. За це я й люблю аніме. Я нічого не розумію, але це дуже цікаво. Вчи англійську. Що тут ще скажеш? Я, типу, думаю, що все розумію, але, наприклад, якщо зараз в режимі онлайн перекладати, то мені треба трохи напрягатися, типу, нема в мене зв'язки повністю з українською мовою, типу, дуже багато якогось такого контенту англійською, якщо там норм, типу, я його розумію, але не можу перекласти. Ну, типу, можу, напевно, але це треба додатково здійснювати дії в мозку, і він не пристосований до цього. Тому я так, хіба буду місцями робити якісь свої зауваження. Тутори, мабуть, один з найкращих способів вчити на сприйняття. Краще, ніж фільми. Думаю, теж так. Ну, я думаю, що фільми, вони є таким початковим варіантом, в плані, що воно тобі трошки дає вуху звикнути до мови, і просто форму. Оце тут той момент, коли в тебе є шейп, і то ж ти слухаєш, наприклад, фільм, наступно ж ти починаєш вже створювати форму, це дивитися, не знаю, якісь влоги, типу відео в ютубчику, а деталі це вже коли починаються туторіали. Класно я придумала яка аналогія. Ладно. Йдемо далі.
Take 80% of the time to do because you'll end up spending much more time refining the drawing. But you can only do that on a very solid foundation, right? Which is form and shape.
Знаєш, я не можу погодитись, хоча, напевно, в мене просто такий стиль, тому що я зазвичай починаю саме з книжок в оригіналі. Я, походу, відразу до деталей переходжу. Знову ж таки, фундаментальна помилка. Типу, не найлегший шлях, але я зазвичай, типу, італійську я теж починала вчити з того, що просто книжку в оригіналі. Пам'ятаю, я ж була, коли я вчилася, в мене якби моя спеціальність була вчитель англійської мови, і в нас було домашнє читання. Нам треба було брати адаптовані книжки і читати їх там раз в місяць. Ми здавалися домашнє читання. Я собі відразу купила книжку в оригіналі, типу, по ній читала. І, типу, для моєї викладачки, типу, я була такою, взагалі нижче середнього студенткою. І тут я така приходжу на це домашнє читання, зробила ці 10 сторінок, як всі робили 10 сторінок цього адаптованої літератури. Я така з оригіналом прийшла. І я, типу, не розуміла, в чому різниця оригіналу від адаптованої. В адаптованих просто якісь простіші структури речень, чи що, якісь такі, що легше для розуміння, а в оригіналі відразу використовуються і ідіоматичні якісь там ці... Просто ти вже читаєш так, як носії мови розуміють. Там мені було, можливо, дійсно складніше, але мені, типу, не було складно. Типу, я не відчувала, що мені легше читати ось ці якісь тексти для адаптовані, ніж оригінальні. Так що просто нагадалося мені щось. Зато моя викладачка мене так зразу, типу, десь там з кінця відразу так піднесла на якийсь там рівень. Я така... а ви думали. Те, що я не знаю всіх ваших тих от теорій і не можу вам всі ці правила пояснити, не означає, що я не знаю, не вмію читати, не вмію говорити англійською.
Right, and then the last triangle, which is nice and fairly straightforward to understand.
Ще один трикутник.
Is how the viewer sees. So, let's just say the viewer's perspective.
Okay.
And this is important to know. Just so that you have a kind of a good, well-rounded understanding of the sort of, you know, the theoretical structure of art theory, art practical, and also how the viewer sees things. So the viewer really sees things, I would say, in a combined way, but generally speaking, they'll see things kind of as forms, and this would be halved like that, I would say. Forms and then details. And viewers, typically, they're not looking at shape composition and composition. I'm talking about your sort of typical average.
Що тут не зрозуміло? Деталі, форма, фігури, теоретична ієрархія, implementation, якщо я не помиляюсь, це типу примінення, ні? А може я не пам'ятаю слово, якщо чесно. Тут як теоретичне приміняється, як буде українською? Застосування. Застосовується на практиці. І як те, що ви практично застосували, потім сприймається глядачем. Тобто, якщо приблизно, хоч ви над деталями маєте працювати найменше, в основному тільки фігури і форма, а глядачі, типу, взагалі не побачать фігур, а лише форму приблизно на однаковому рівні з деталями. Прикладна теорія. Дякую, Гмик. Ти, як завжди, просто золотко. Що б ми без тебе робили? Залишайся таким багатогранним і потрібним на цьому каналі, як ти є. Як це? Тішуся.
viewer, even when you yourself are looking at artworks, you know, you have this mode of art appreciation, and that mode is much different from sort of art analysis, because when you're looking at a piece that you really like, or you've got artwork, a little artwork folder or artwork collection or something, right? Or maybe it's a big folder, who knows, where you've got collected artworks. When you look at stuff that you like, you kind of are enamored by it, you're sold, it's managing to persuade you of its believability. And so you're really noticing the forms first, and then the details second. And you can kind of see here in this sort of third triangle, let's just kind of label these 1, 2, and 3. Oh, actually, perhaps that's not a good idea. Let's just call it A, B, and C, right? You'll kind of notice in this third triangle why, excuse me, why beginners struggle so much when they're starting to draw, right? Because they're going on what they've seen, and what they've only seen and believed to be true about the world is basically the forms and the details, and they're generally equally weighted. So they'll kind of try and draw something that looks like a head and then fill it with a million details. You know, that's kind of a common beginner problem. But nevertheless, how we see things is different from how we make things, and is different from the theory of things. So another way to understand this is kind of the recipe of a cake, right, is quite substantially different from how you actually make the cake, right? And quite substantially different, that is, to how you taste the cake, right? So there's kind of an analogy in there, and hopefully that's helpful to you. So this is essentially the kind of structure of art, right? And all artworks really fit into this, not just drawing. You know, drawings, paintings, landscapes, portraits, and so on. Character designs, vehicle designs, everything really kind of fills into this kind of structure when we're looking at how art is made. Nevertheless, that is pretty much the end of this lesson. And we're going to move on to technicalities versus emotional impact, which is kind of a high-level topic in some senses. But hopefully this has helped you understand the structures, and really constantly revisit this video, and especially focus on point 2 as to how we needed to implement form and shape at the same time, then details. And please know that we will get into detail on these shape elements as we move through the course, so you will know what shape really means, what forms really mean, what details really mean as we move through the course. Cool, catch you in the next lesson.
See like an artist. Як це? Дивись як художник, чи бач як художник.
In learning to see as an artist, we want to use our theoretical model of shape, form, and detail when we're observing the world, and try and view things that we see in reality in this way, which will help us grab the details, grab the structure, grab the designs of what it is that we're looking for, and get it into our minds, and have us really understand things in a more complex way and less of a simplistic way when we're observing the world around us. And the first way we really want to look at things is looking at things in purely a shape way, where we're kind of ignoring inner details and ignoring lighting and three-dimensionality, and we're really just kind of looking primarily first at the overall silhouette of objects. And I'll draw out her silhouette here in a general sense. And we're looking at the shapes formed by the silhouette and the asymmetry of that silhouette. And then also going into the features and then looking at the basic flat 2D shapes that are being made on a particular object that we're observing, and kind of starting to recognize just these flat shapes and look at things in this flat way. It's not to say that you want to learn things in this flat way, but rather that we want to use what we understand of these flat kind of shapes to help us understand proportions very well. So here I'm kind of just putting lines around the big shapes, the big inner shapes, and just getting these very flat, two-dimensional objects out of them, particularly on the face, and we will cover facial proportions later on. Just grasping these basic flat shapes helps us position them, size them, and space them correctly on the face, so that we can have appealing looking faces and proportionately pleasing faces. So really, all of these shapes, for example, this really random asymmetrical shape here, this shape here, this shape here, this weird shape at the top, this is just a way we want to look at objects, a perspective or a lens, if you wish, that we want to look at objects in the real world first. We want to look at just the general shapes that are being formed first. Moving on from that, we want to then start looking at the forms. And the forms are really the 3D elements defined by perspective and lighting, and start really trying to grasp what are the basic forms that are underlying these elements. So for example, in the head, we might say, all right, well, there's a sort of a spherical form here, and these forms come down here. There's kind of a jaw-shaped form, and there's the form of the ears, and imagining what the back sides of objects would look like and the sides of objects, and getting a sense of the planes. So for example, in her head here, this is the front plane, this is the side plane, kind of feeling out the forms here, here, and kind of imagining what is the mass and the volume of the structure of just the basic form structure of her back and her chest here, and drawing through things in your mind and imagining, for example, the arm. Maybe the arm is really just a cylinder, right? Just a cylinder, and then the hand itself may be some kind of block. And looking at objects in reality and imagining what are their basic forms. So here we have perhaps another cylinder again, and the forearm as well is another cylinder, and I'm drawing through here to kind of feel out these cylindrical shapes of the arms. So we want to have a form sense when we're looking at things in the world. And then finally, once we've observed the shapes and the forms, and we're getting a feel for the forms and the three-dimensional forms, three-dimensionality of the objects, we then can take a look at the details, the color of the shirt, the texture of the skin, the color of the lips, the detailing of the teeth, for example, the details in her eyes, the details of her hair, the hair strands, and all the little fine details, really looking at things like texture and things like color, and kind of getting a feel for those things. And really, they're the last things that we really want to be concerned with when we're working. And so this is how we want to learn to see objects. We want to look at the shapes, then the forms, and then the details, and constantly be observing and studying things in this way, breaking down these complex elements into these basic categories, and helping us to really observe the world more like artists, and really capture and be inspired by the...
Коротше, суть. Маємо навчитися дивитися як художник. В першу чергу бачити, які фігури в цьому об'єкті, потім надавати їм певної форми, а вже потім даватися в деталі. Таким чином ми будемо дивитися як справжній художник. Ось. Я щось упустила? Гмик, ти тут будеш модератор мого розуміння англійської. Дякую, що погодився, хоч я тебе і не питала, що ти погодиш. Я просто придумала це.
Things that we see in reality. Let's move on.
Гмик таки вже давно втік. Бачити форми, це я можу.
In this lesson, we're going to look at technicalities versus emotional impact. Now, right off the bat, emotional impact, that is a piece that has a lot of emotion to it. It has a mood, it has a story, and it has feeling. A piece...
Так, скіл, типу, навички, навичка проти емоцій в малюванні. Типу, що важливіше, як круто ви малюєте, чи як ви передаєте цим своїм малюнком те, що ви хочете передати емоційно? Як? Вам буде цікаво дивитися? От, наприклад, одразу згадується, типу, якісь умовні Сімпсони чи Південний парк. Ніби такі, здається, примітивні малюнки, але як ви їх любите? Ось, напевно, ось така суть тут має бути. Я, звичайно, ще не знаю, але це моя просто особиста думка. Зараз ми їх глянемо, що він мав на увазі.
With these emotional elements, we'll always win out over a piece that is more technically correct, but lacking in these emotional elements. You know, technicalities often occur, for example, when someone critiques your work, or you've seen work being critiqued, where someone will say, hey, that arm is drawn incorrectly, or that head is on skew, or something like that. However, if the piece has enough of an emotive element to it, enough feeling in it, a lot of the time this
Знаєте, говорю, така, як слухаю далі його, я така думаю, так, ну я так зараз видала такий приклад, типу, Сімпсони або Південний парк, це примітивно. Я така, ну, спробуй намалюй Сімпсонів або Південний парк, наскільки тебе вистачить, наскільки для тебе це буде примітивно. Просто так, думки вголос.
Causes a blindness in the viewer, so to speak. Perhaps even a willing blindness, that they're willing to disregard the technical correctness just because of the joy that they're feeling or the the emotions that they're feeling from that particular piece, right? The feelings that they're getting from the piece. Now, that's not to say that we should abandon all technical rules and things like that, but rather that by understanding how weighty the emotive elements of a piece are, that we can use this knowledge to leverage it in a very similar way to the way that poets leverage poetic license, right? Where they're making up words and things that don't exist. The words are not technically correct. Yet the poets use it in such a way that it really just adds to the poem. And, you know, we don't really look at it and people don't go, well, look at this fool making up these random words. You know, this doesn't exist. Is this guy educated? No, we go, wow, that's a pretty cool made up word and that's awesome. So we kind of want to leverage the emotional impact of our pieces and of course definitely instill as much story, feeling and emotion in our work as possible, therefore sort of freeing us in some respects to not being so hard on ourselves about the technical aspects of a particular piece. So the last thing that I want to say as well is that you're going to find, as we discuss this later on, that this relates a lot to believability and realism and the difference between these two things and which one is more important in an artwork. So, let's go to the next lesson.
Коротше, тут гарна думка, типу, головне, що ви вірите цьому малюнку, чи він дуже реалістичний, що для вас важливіше? Ну, може він не зовсім так сказав, але мені сподобалась суть в такому от уточненні.
In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the story is everything. Now, I know that perhaps at this stage of the course you're thinking like, wow, man, this is wordy. Are we ever going to do some drawing? Trust me, most of the course is drawing related. But this is stuff is very, very important to know, to have in your mind, to learn, to digest. So really take this seriously and consider it very, very important. All right, so the story, right? The first big point is vision, right? If you've done the Art Fundamentals course, or even if you haven't, it doesn't really matter. Vision is your preconception or your conceptualizing of the character that you're drawing. Thinking about who the character is, where is the character perhaps in the present scene, what worlds do they live in, what is their personality, what is the story of the piece that you're currently drawing, what is the feeling, what is the mood, what is the expression on their face, what is the piece communicating. The story is extremely, 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 extremely important to creating a piece that is emotive. And as we've learned in the technicalities versus emotional impact lesson, emotional impact is crucial in creating a piece that is appealing. Ultimately, we really want to create works that are appealing. We want our work to have appeal. That is the ability to persuade someone to look at it and to maintain their looking at it and give them some joy or fully communicate the message of the piece to them in an effective way that they find satisfying. Now, one of the most important things I could ever tell you about art, and I'm going to do my best to make this as clear as possible, is to have you realize that the artwork itself is just the medium, right? Perhaps it seems obvious, right? But let me give you some examples. A book is a medium, movie is a medium, a newspaper is a medium, a magazine is a medium, right? Art is a medium, music is a medium, right? These are just mediums. The artwork that you end up with in many ways is just the medium, right? The message, however, is that thing that you're communicating through the medium, right? And the message is very, very, very important. As I tell students constantly, make something cool. Don't make a cool artwork, right? Don't think about the artwork, think about the thing. Have your thoughts on the thing itself that you're creating. In our case, characters, right? Think deeply about the character, who the character is, what the character's wearing, where the character's at, what their personality is, and so on and so forth, right? Making something cool is much more important than making a cool artwork, right? The concept in itself should be good. It should be able to be described with 100 keywords. You know you have a poor message if there are only a few keywords that could be attributed to what is communicated through the medium. You know, if you design a great character, it should be able to be communicated effectively and appealingly through any medium. Let's say for argument's sake, a 3D model, or in a book, or in a comic book, or in a painting, a beautiful painting. The character's concept itself should hold most of the appeal, and your implementation of that should be, you know, sufficient enough to adequately describe and do justice to the concept that you've come up with. So once again, artwork is a medium. It's not the message. And the message is extremely, extremely important. And in our case, the message is the story, and the story is everything, right? The story is everything, especially when we're talking about character artwork. Hope that was really clear. Let's move on. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about drawing for appeal. Now, I have mentioned the word appeal before, and I've mentioned that our work needs to be appealing. But where this really comes from is between contrasting two different ideas, right? And the first idea is believability. The second is realism. Do we try to draw for the sake of realism, or do we try to draw for the sake of believability? And which is more important? Well, hopefully the answer is obvious. Something can be very real or very realistic, be drawn very accurately, very technically correct. But if it lacks believability, something that is worse off in those categories but is more believable will always win out. We want to remember this when we're creating our characters, that believability in perhaps their clothing, their pose, what they're doing, who they are, is much more of a meaningful factor than them looking realistic. The reason I wanted to talk about this is I find that a lot of students tend to get caught up on this idea of realism. You know, is this thing realistic? Is what I'm drawing realistic? I'm trying to make it so realistic, or I'm struggling to make it realistic. And that is not really the problem. The problem is that you need to find out how to make what you're drawing believable. This goes again to poetic license, in a sense, where you could draw anatomy a little off. But if it's a little off yet believable, or completely accurate yet unbelievable, people are always going to find the more believable drawing more appealing, right? So really think about this, contemplate it yourself. It's just some small little section I wanted to pop in there. Consider to yourself the differences between believability and realism. Think on it, digest it a little bit more.
Так, це потім. Стоп. Давайте будемо дорослішати як художник трошки пізніше. Що я хотіла сказати? Типу, знаєте, в мене таке враження, от я почуваюся настільки просвіщений, як буде, просвітлений, нехай буде так, в цих всіх штуках, але це все до того моменту, поки вдаємося до практики. Типу, так, я так, в принципі, і теж думала завжди, я теж так вважаю, але сама, спробуй добре, типу, окей, хай ти всю цю фігню, типу, філософію всю ти десь там вважаєш, що ти її шариш, але як тільки я почну займатися цим практично, зразу вся моя філософія десь там далеко і залишиться, а на практиці буде якась типові помилки початківця. Це мене просто лякає, якось так, просто лякає. Спеціально мене залякує цей чувак. Ну і ладно. Так, поки що я вам поставлю Be Right Back. Повернуся напевно, через 20 хвилин. У вас зараз 10:50, а я, значить, в 11:10 повернуся.
보이는 바람 인기를 논하자면 안에 입만 아픔 Of boys not my boys 싹둑싹둑 자름 우리 이름 들린다면 뚜루뚜루 맞음 Drip drip I said I bust it down top to the bottom 검은색 분홍빛 all up in it make it lit like Yeah with some bitches you can manage 또 이 어려운 걸 해내줘 우리 예쁘장한 savage with some 예쁘장한 savage You better run 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 You better run 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 All my diamonds stay yellow all bright bright Get 'em blind can't find me I'm out of sight If you mad stay mad we not alike S-A-V-A-D keep it pretty pretty savage
비슷한 걸 걸쳤지만 자태부터 다름 짠하고 나타나면 카펫부터 가름 블랙했다 핑크했다 내 맘대로 바쁜 네 질투가 문제야 Maybe I'm the problem
검은색 분홍빛 all up in it make it rain like Yeah with some bitches you can manage 또 이 어려운 걸 해내줘 우린 예쁘장한 savage with some 예쁘장한 savage
You better run 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 You better run run run
All my diamonds stay yellow all bright bright Get 'em blind can't find me I'm out of sight If you mad stay mad we not alike S-A-V-A-D keep it pretty pretty savage Pretty girl 웃어주지만 마냥 약하진 않아 And I wish you would 비바람이 불수록 더 높이 날아 I got nothing left to say to you 원하면 보여줄게 attitude 굳이 말 안 해도 다 알잖아 You know savage
봐도 예쁘장한
So pretty 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 savage
봐도 예쁘장한
So pretty 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 차디찬 한겨울이 덮친 듯 yeah. 시간은 다 얼어버리고 잔인한 그 바람이 남긴 듯한 어둠은 더 깊어버리고 벗어나리요 끝없이 펼쳐진 기억 없는 계절을 지워내리요 뜨겁지 못한 날들의 홀로 데인 흉터를 그물을 내리요 내 안에 눈물이 더 못살게 난 화를 내리요 더 화를 내리요 잃었던 봄을 되찾게 차갑게 부는 바람에 눈이 하얗게 덮인 마음이 아침이 오면 부디 모두 녹일 수 있게 불을 지펴라 Yeah. 내 너의 흔적 남지 않게 하리 못다운 원망도 훨훨 타리 쓸쓸한 추위를 걷어가길 남겨진 시들은 꽃길을 지려밟지 하늘 풀이라 다시금 봄을 누리라 추억은 모조리 불이 나 걸음이 돼 찬란한 꽃을
난
피우리라
화를 내리요 더 화를 내리요 잃었던 봄을 되찾게 차갑게 부는 바람이 눈이 하얗게 덮인 마음이
아침이 오면 부디 모두 녹을 수 있게 불을 지펴라 향만 너를 지켜라 가려진 눈앞이 피로 물들여지네 Tell me why I don't lie 차가운 바람은 불고 시선이 느껴져 와 혈관을 타고 흐르는 Oh pain 묶여진 두 손 저려 오는 이 느낌 모두 내게 돌에 던져도 벗어나지 못해 하나도 난 재미없어 누구를 위해서인지 누가 좀 말해줘 Tell me 타오르는 불길 위에 now Please I don't want to scream Double eyes come 눈을 뜬다 눈을 뜬다 Please I don't want to scream 어둠 속에 퍼져 scream
가면 뒤에 트릭 가소로운 freak 거진증 오간 나 무작위 속의 target 타오른 갈증 삼켜도 위선은 다내 탓이라 해내 멀리 겹친 절벽 위에 후회만 남을 선택이 돼
날카로운 칼날처럼 말에서 말이 상처되어 파고들어도 끊지 못하는 숨 하나도 난 알 수 없어 누구를 위해서인지 누가 좀 말해줘 Tell me 피어오른 연기 속에 나 Please I don't want to scream
Double eyes come 눈을 뜬다 눈을 뜬다
모두 떠난 후 다시 눈을 떠 사라져버린 흔적 Can't believe me 슬퍼하지 마라 No more, no more, no more 날 위해 no more, no more, no more
네가 본 모든 걸 잊어 아무 일 없었던 믿어 그렇게 하나들 모두가 미쳐가
I just wanna make you scream 모두 나를 보고 scream I just wanna make you scream 두 눈을 감은 순간 검은 공간 나 홀로 남겨져 다시 눈을 떠도 꿈을 깨도 내 현실은 다르지 않아 거친 불처럼 불처럼 쉽게 말처럼 안돼 말처럼
그래 뭐 시간이다 해결해 주겠지
끝도 없이 반복되는 지금 길을 잃어 헤매고 있지만 너에게 닿을 수 있다면 피리를 불어라 I know what you want from me 피리를 불어라 끝없이 날 down for me 시간이 없어 now it's not too late 너밖에 없어 say
아무 소리 없는 꿈 온통 나를 보는 눈 yeah. I don't wanna go 너를 찾고 있는 중 yeah. 놓치고 싶지 않아 내게서 날 뻗어봐 그렇게 쉽지 않아 I better go for a while 처럼 무처럼 쉽게 말처럼 안돼 말처럼 그래 뭐 시간이 다 해결해주겠지 끊임없이 반복되는 지금 아직도 난 헤매고 있지만 네가 꼭 그럴 수 있도록 우리를 불어라 I know what you want from me 우리를 불어라 끝없이 난 down for me 시간이 없어 now it's not too late 너밖에 없어 save me now give me now emergency 이름을 정하는 밤 푸른 안개가 되어 날 안아줄 수 있다면 나는 스며 걸었던 길을 다시 잃어도 네가 될 때까지도 나는 기다릴 텐데 피리를 불어라 피리를 불어라 끝없이 난 down for me 너밖에 없어 save me hold me now 피리를 불어라 I'm so bad I'm so bad 네 뻔한 답답답 길 가도 블라블라블라 더 늘어지기 전에 보란 듯이 걸러 건네지마 골라봐자 틱택톡 어머니 메시지니 더 크게 샤샤 너답게 하하 감출 수도 없게 burn 달라지는 네 눈빛 까맣게 높던 별 너만 보일게 아찔한 눈앞처럼 follow me 가시 같은 게 so what 어둠 같은 게 so what 거리 없는 게 stop so what take that so what I'm so bad 그게 어때 I'm so bad 뭐 어때 I'm so bad 더 자유롭게 I'm so bad 막 타고 일어나 달리는 법 떠오르게 해줄게 뜨겁게 널 끌어내도 널 위한 세상의 중심은 너 비좁은 세상은 너 좀 더 높이 가볍게 skip on my own feet 어서 따라와 봐봐 이끌린 대로 don't worry 샥샥 벌써 넌 괜찮아 불꽃으로 날려burn 뜨거워진 이 눈빛 가장 높이 빛난 별 잡아 보일게 기다렸다면 끝없이 follow me 가시 같은 게 so what
모든 타깃은 날 향해 있어 말없이 베이는 상처 말 안 해도 알 수 있어 Yeah, 아무런 표정도 없이 눈이 익숙하단 듯이 벗어나지 못해 but I know
I'ma get the big paradox 쉽게 생각하면 널 지키는 killer 지옥 끝에 선다 하나같이 bitter 입을 걸어 잠궈 freeze off
이유 없는 시선 뿌리면은 question 죄의식은 이미 그들에게 없어 막을 수 없이 사무치는 맘 참지 못했던 난 너를 위해서 먹구름에 쌓인 깊어지는 밤 내려털었던 날 줬던 날 굳게 가로잠글게 또 가 Where is the love 가시 같은 그 말로 널 아프게 한다면 열지 못하게 내가 Yeah 눈 감아서 막혀 넌또 막혀만 밟지 넌 뒷걸음만 쳤다면 거기서 변하지 않아 뻔하지 no Get the key set you free 너 이제 그만둬 숨 바꿔 질 바짝 가려와 more dark coming up lock the door 막을 수 없이 사무치는 맘 참지 못했던 난 너를 위해서 불어오는 밤 거친 바람과 내려털었던 날 줬던 날 굳게 가로잠글게 누가 Where is the love 가시 같은 그 말로 널 아프게 한다면 열지 못하게 소중한 시간들을 왜 증오로 채우는가 Too many angels dying now I'm gonna change your mind 다시 숨 쉴 수 있게 No Where is the love 가시 같은 그 말로 널 아프게 한다면 열지 못하게 내가 아무 발걸음 다 말하지 대답을 빼앗거나 입을 닫지 그 아래 깨물린 붉게 물든 lips 굳이 숨기지 않을 반항기 나랑 발걸음 좀 다르지 딸내리처럼 아주 반드시 칼같이 잘린 똑단 발머리 나는 울리지 않을 뿐이지 다시 깜깜해진 밤날 무반 듯한 내 바람 다시 그 속에 난 갇힌 듯해 그때 창을 두드린 날 비추는 눈빛이 날 비감는 네 느낌 Let's pump it up 다 똑같지 재미없잖아 우라라 아왜 우라라 왜 안돼 모두 나와 같이 리듬 위를 groove it 기분 따라 느낌 따라 why not do it 주문을 외워보자 열랄라 멋진 이 밤이 만든 tomorrow Take it to the right take it to the left dance all night 나가는 대로 상상해봐도 이루어져 길이 나타나져 절로 눈치는 보지마 그게 중요해 Don't kill my vibe that's a no-no 아무 발걸도 말하지 뭐 그럴지도 난 대답하지 그 순간 쏟아진 시선에 이렇게 쉽게 오해를 사는 내 눈빛 I'm not a bad girl 더 완벽히 넘어선 안 될 선은 지키지 그 모든 것들과 어긋난데도 난 내 중심을 지킬 뿐이지 달빛 축제 열린 밤 황홀해진 이 순간 가슴 벅차도록 눈부신데 지금 시간 12시 눈을 감아보는데 날 위감는 네 느낌 Let's pump it up Yeah 어딜 보니 나만 따라와 Let's pump it up. Yeah. 꿈만 같이. 다시 바꿔봐. Let's burn it up. 너도 알지? 꿈이 아니야. Why not do it? Ooh la la, away, away, away. Ooh la la, 왜 안 돼, 안 돼. I'm in the zone. We are CLC. Go. Nice. 자 나와봐라 한 바라봐 넘어오나봐 쟨 나 몰랐나봐 이제 잘 찾아봐라 내가 여기 챙길 거 다 챙겨갈란다 와라 take 갈란다 너 네가 내 속을 아니 내가 네 맘을 보니 하루 이틀 또 한두 번도 못 아는 건 새삼스레 너라고 그래 배려없는 나의 몸에 눈빛에 모든 시선이 멈추지 근데 너는 몰라 왜 너도 날 원하잖아 그만해요 다 알고 있어요 괜히 아닌 척 마요 듣고 있나요 나타나봐요 나를 봐줘요 사실적인 불안해요 나 너무 오래 걸리잖아요 당장 날 데려가 빨리 나와라 나와라 와라
Можу собі хлібців з горіховою пастою і
날좀 바라봐라 이거 챙기는 거 봐라 와라가 안아줄게 너 자꾸 말은 늘어놔 날좀 바라봐라 더는 센 척하지 마라 이따 후회하지 너 좀더 놀아봐라 너 아직 몰라 너는 진짜 내
Дизайнер, привіт.
모습이다 보여줄게 아직 너무나도 많은 걸내맘 모든 채 내게 숨지 마
Там якщо слухати, то вже було не страшно. Але потім життя без двіги і без проблем відносно. Хоча думаю, все одно музику тихіше. Музика дуже тихо буде, бо я зараз переключуся на курс, але перед цим з'їм хоча б один шматок. Падає все. Блін, купила собі горіхову пасту. Вона така смачна. Ну, настільки смачна, що я її планувала їсти 2 тижні, а з'їла за 5 днів. Коли я купила її в суботу. Ні, який сьогодні 5-й день, коли субота, неділя, понеділок, вівторок, середа. 5-й день, да? Це так токсично прозвучало, пробачте. Ти про що? Горіхова паста, то типу нутелла, але без шоколаду. Ну, в нутеллі там горіхів максимум 40% від цього як в хорошій нутеллі. Десь, по-моєму, 30, якщо я не помиляюся. А в основному там всі різні добавки. А горіхова паста тут як мінімум 60%. Тому нутеллу я взагалі навіть... Нутелла і поруч не стояла. Нутелла це просто цукор і все. А тут горіх реально, тут прям відчувається, що ти їсиш передріблений лісовий горіх, і воно таке. Ще купувала таку ж саму горіхову пашту з шоколадом, вона мені не дуже. Ось це прям сам горіх. Я просто люблю дуже арахісову пасту. Мені зазвичай її з України передавали. У мене там є своя. Ой, пальмова олія, це вже, знаєш, так. Якщо в якихось таких, типу, великих що роблять, а я купую з України, типу, домашнього виробництва. Ну, як домашнього. Не знаю, в мене моя улюблена це паста бурундук. Я разок пробував недавно арахісову нутеллу. Та я своє попереднє повідомлення прочитала, стидно стало. Та нормально, головне, що все по суті. Я не сприйняла це як щось токсичне. Не переживай, все добре. Іра, як модератор, ти можеш слів не підбирати і все буде добре. Типу, не треба там дуже сильно себе оце... Я знаю, що ти з добрими намірами, ти вже якби людина перевірена. Подивись на Харді. Ой, боже. Не дивись тільки на Харді, типу. Ти ж не на Харді, так що ще все фігня. До речі, ви побачили, у нас є нові нагороди. Можна отримати цю віпку на 3 місяці за 30 тисяч анімашок. Це так, між іншим. Згадалось мені. Мені пропонували навічно на халяву, а я відмовлявся. Почну матюжитися в чаті, ото буде норм. Знаєш, Хмик в тебе, як на мою думку, взагалі найбільший самоконтроль серед всіх моїх модераторів. Тому що, ну от прям дуже рідко щось таке. Ці анімашки треба 3 місяці збирати, ну якщо я буду більше стрімити, ви будете більше дивитися. Якщо, наприклад, підписатися на канал, то взагалі анімашки дуже швидко збираються. Найбільший контроль серед тих, хто не став мечником. Фіть. Мик просто робот. Та ні, він так час від часу там щось послаблює трохи. Але все одно. Все, що я не люблю, він вже за ці часи нашого знайомства точно вивчив. І якщо йому захочеться від мене позбутися, він просто чудово зможе використати всі інструменти. Мені так здається. Вмикає найбільше серед своїх модераторів, боюсь. Він як темна конячка. А тільки ви Дані не кажіть, то він вважає себе найбільшим злом. І Мик там такий сидить, прямо зараз такий корона світиться, він такий сміхом злобного генія. Ха-ха-ха! Бажано на тому троні з Гри престолів. І Мик таке зараз порівняв зі своєю реальністю. Ну! Блін, я з'їм ще одну, воно таке смачне. Я аж 3 штучки собі зробила просто. Сорі всім, хто чекає продовження курсу про малювання, я трошки пожру. Потім ще 20 хвилин пострімлю, потім ще на 20 хвилин піду на перерву. Офігенні в мене наповнені сенсом стріми. Міксон Б, прошу вас, не будьте злим. Ще мізинець притримує. Айс. Що не так з мізинцем? Я вже така на свої мізинці дивлюся. Та хіба ти не їсишся? А хто сказав, що я зібралася наїдатися? Це мій ланч. Точніше, перекус. Ланч так сказала, типу, ланч мій буде. Не буде ланч такий. Це мій перекус. Як правильно українською, перекус чи перекус? Мені здається, що перекус. Або виявиться взагалі, що це русизм. Блін, ну це буде... Сунба це, типу, старший. Старший по званню. Серед всіх зібравшихся. Тобі не подобається? Знаєш, ми тебе ж взагалі не бачимо. Навіть те, що ви мене бачите, воно взагалі відрізняється від мене реальної. Типу, якісь штуки в реалі зовсім не такі, якими вони здаються на екрані. Тому це, типу, норма мати свій віртуальний образ в головах інших людей. Боже. Чому це так офігенно? Ми можемо ще щось додати. Іра, нагадай мені, звідки ти, будь ласка. Як вона смачно хрумкає. Це все не заігруюсь. А як я плямкаю. Еротично. Свідків скела стає все більше. Не знаю, тут лише одна богиня в цьому стрімі, так що нічого не знаю. Чи я відрізняюся? Та я з людиною, що придумала гмика, не маю нічого спільного. Ні, ну якщо тебе придумав на Харді, то слава Богу. Знаєш, я просто уявляю кілька варіантів найгірших, які тільки можуть бути, хто такий гмик. Типу, в моїй голові. І якщо це виявиться один з тих варіантів, якби, треба буде переглянути свої погляди на добро і зло. Що це ви тут поробляєте? Дивитеся, як я їм? Я таки, напевно, з'їм ще цей третій шматочок. Ну ладно вже. Шматочок, так сказала. То він буде на мене дивитися, я все одно захочу його похрумати. Дякую. Я тобі казала вчора, що тебе щось на Харді шукав. Не пам'ятаю, що. Я взагалі люблю рисові хлібці. Зверху горіхова паста, льон, чия і, тобто, як її? Забула слово. Кунжут. Капець, скільки всього. Смачно. Да. От би пакет хлібців і банку пасти, і ложку, і все. Снідала сьогодні вівсянкою. Просто я дуже рано прокидаюся зараз. Зараз в мене вже перекус пішов. Від мого сніданку пройшло вже 3 години. Якраз. А у мене кукурудзяні смачні. Я не дуже люблю, до речі, кукурудзяні. Хлібці я собі уявляю як маленькі буханці, а хлібці це ось ці штучки. Бачиш, як воно виглядає по структурі. Ти таки не написала, з чим в тебе тортик, Іра. Ділись, нехай всі заздрять. Це якісь міні-коржики. Мені подобається твоя інтерпретація. Доїлася. Що, підемо дивитися, хто такий Валер Пістоль, Ютуб, який нам закинув свою рекламку в чат. Мають бути торти з начинкою іншого торта. Тепер я хочу солодкого. Хочу солодощів. Знаєте цю рекламу презервативів? Ну, реклама «Хочу солодощів», реклама презервативів. Типу, заходить тато з малим в супермаркет, там щось собі купує, малий такий побачив купа пакетів з солодким. Він такий падає на підлогу, починає по ній качатися і кричати: «Хочу солодощів! Хочу солодощів! Хочу солодощів!» І там таке: «Бережіть своє життя, користуйтесь презервативами». Дуже стара реклама. Одна з, типу, якби, класика в рекламі. Це я колись вивчала. Ну, коротше, проходила якийсь курс давним-давно по маркетингу. Кайфова. О, да. Я пам'ятаю, мій брат в коледжі з цією рекламою теж виступав. Я поробив адаптацію колись. Зайшло їм там теж. Ех, часи. Вимастила все горіховою пастою. Вгадайте, хто молодець? Я молодець. Нічого, повитираю до лосінів, потім їх виперу. Якби принцеса в кадрі, богиня. Міс Грація. 2021. Лайфхаки сучасних принцес. До зв'язку. Ну все, до діла можна йти. Ну ок. Так, а я тим часом. Думаю, норм. Дуже тихо музика чи не дуже тихо? У мене тепер відрижка пішла, сорі, народ. Я надіюсь, вомбат цього не бачить. Що природньо, то нормально, будь здорова. Та логіка в цьому я, але я не чхала. І тут вам от такий добрий день. Угу. Це як вчора дивились ми трансляцію про дорами ввечері. Ну, точніше, ми дивились трансляцію дорами ввечері, і заходить на Харді, щось там каже: Іра, Мі, я вас люблю. І я така: ми теж тебе любимо. І такий вомбат зразу починає писати. Я така: і він спеціально це робить. Я то думала, що в наших стосунках тільки я все хочу контролювати, але виявляється, це в нас такий, знаєте, взаємообмін. Що ж, наш наступний, як це, урок, як це буде? Зрілість, як зрілий як художник. Ні, зрілий художник, якось так. Дозрів як художник. Ладно.
In this lesson, I'd like to just touch on a few points about maturity as an artist that I hope will be encouraging to you and also just really help you on your journey of becoming a great character artist. The first point is that I want to encourage you to be very selfish about your art. And when I say selfish, I don't mean not loving to others. What I mean is really do the work you want to do. Focus on your own work. Don't worry about other people's work. Don't worry about comparing yourself to other people's art. You could never be them. You could never do what they do simply because you aren't them. Focus on your own work. Focus on your own style. Focus on your own art goals. That is very, very important. When you look at someone else's work, perhaps an artist you feel might be better than you, look at it in an appreciative sense and also see what you can learn. But if there's something I want to caution you against, never, ever, ever, ever compare yourself to another artist. Once again, you are not that person. It is very, very likely that it is impossible for you to do work in the exact same way that they do it. It's just not possible. You're not them. You are you. So focus on your own work and your own self, in a sense, in terms of how you create art. Create art that you want to do, and in doing so, you're not pandering to the art that you think people want to see or that might impress others. Do art that impresses you. I think that's primarily what I want you to get from when I say be very selfish with your artwork. Create artwork that impresses you and that meets the standards that you would want of yourself. Next, I'd like to talk about fear. Now, I'm no stranger to fear in art, although I have to say these days I don't really worry about it that much. Of course, we will all experience fear in art and art making to some extent. The first thing I want to say is that if you have the time, if you have the inclination, and if you have the funds to do it, definitely buy a book called Art and Fear. It will be very, very helpful to you on your art journey, and it's definitely an excellent read, and it covers many of the fears that artists typically feel. Right? So definitely consider buying Art and Fear. It is a great resource. It is a very valuable resource for you. The second thing is you're going to have to learn as you're drawing and painting that failure isn't something to be feared, right? Failure is actually wonderful. Think about a kid who burns himself.
Якраз вчора дивилася нове відео блогмайстра, де він розповідає: ми всі невдахи, ми всі, типу, робимо щось не так, і це норма. І тут такий теж говорить чувак, що поразка, ну поразка тут погане слово, невдача – це норма. Це наш досвід, це нам потрібно. Завдяки невдачам ми ростемо як творчі особистості, нехай це буде так. Згодна з ними, згодна.
On the stove for the first time, right? At that moment, sure, it does suck. I mean, he's burned himself and that's horrible. But he has learned something pretty valuable from that experience. And it's unlikely that he's going to make that mistake again, right? So what I want to encourage you to do is start becoming fearless. Be courageous. Be brave. Don't
Все
stare
про
at the
мене.
blank page in trepidation. Don't
Fearless.
worry about drawing or put it off or procrastinate because you're worried it might not be good. Who cares about good? What is good?
Я ніколи не прокрастиную. Ну подумаєш, 2 роки відкладала цей курс. 2 грьобаних роки.
I mean, do we have various ideals and standards of what we feel good is? It may vary.
Я за ці 2 роки вже могла тут сидіти, типу, малювати така, типу, я шикарний артист, блін, ага, фіг там. Не повторюйте моїх помилок. Починайте відразу і робіть це. Не відтягуйте до смерті, блін.
From person to person. As long as you're learning the theory, you're practicing daily based on the theory, you will gain skill in art. So you don't need to worry about being good or that creating a good piece. Just create the work you want to
Це не
create.
прокрастинація, це
And over
відкладання.
time, you will reach a place where you
Прокрастинація і є
realize that
відкладання.
you've gotten to where you wanted to be in your art. Ultimately, that's what it's going to come down to. You're going to want to be somewhere, and you're going to have to take a journey to get there. So let go of your fear. Maybe it's too easy to say that to you, to let go of your fear. But I want to encourage you. You need to be courageous.
Тому
You
що
need to be brave.
розстановкою
And more
пріоритетів цього теж не
importantly, you need
назвеш.
to be
Навряд чи я
willing to
займалася чимось
fail. You need
пріоритетно
to be willing to
важливішим за
fail
ці
a
роки.
lot. If you're unwilling to fail and
Знаєте,
you don't
якби
like
я
the taste of failure,
за цей час,
perhaps
типу,
art
щось
isn't for you.
важливе вивчила, зробила, то так,
Lastly, I
ну,
want to
ладно, я
talk
почала
about the
вести
fear
YouTube,
related to
Twitch,
technical
купу всяких
ability.
штук
That is your
всім
ability to
вивчила.
draw good lines, to
Ой,
understand
на харді
forms, to
з'явився
implement the
в
theory
чаті.
correctly.
Привіт.
Technical ability is very much a learned thing. It is very much a learned thing. You learn the theory, you implement exercises, you grind it into your brain, and eventually it
Саме
becomes
так.
a part of you. When it becomes a part of
Часто
you,
є
you
частина
start doing
мене.
drawings, people look at your work and they think it's magic coming out of that pencil. But really it's just repetition of the theory, constantly hammering it into your brain that you're able to eventually make it a part of you. So I want you to not be afraid of doing art because you're worried about your technical ability. It really is a technical thing. Once again, remember,
багато
art is a
інтересів.
medium. So when you're learning how to implement in this medium,
Принаймні,
it really is just a
курс
process of,
малювання
well,
в мене
this
був
this
відкладений
works
ще
and this doesn't work.
2019 року.
I also want to add that
Я не буду малювати кожен день. Я вирішила, буду 1 раз в тиждень робити собі цей курс по малюванню. Все потрішки, все потрішки. Ми тебе недавно згадували, до речі, та. Не в хорошому сенсі, звичайно.
you know, when we're talking about character drawing, we're talking about anything that's kind of realist, right? We're differentiating ourselves substantially from people who do abstract art and postmodern art and those other types of art forms. We really are realists, and the
Ира,
beauty
люблю
about
тебя.
realism is rules. You learn the rules, you implement the rules, you get better at art. So really don't fear drawing and creating art and perhaps even completing this course because you're worried about your technical ability. You'll see after the course is complete that you will have the tools you need, the theoretical tools you need to start practicing and refining your technical ability into just a beautifully crafted, let's say, weapon of art, if you wish. You'll find
Weapon
that
of
the
art.
course will provide you with plenty of tools that you can use to really refine your technical ability to something really beautiful and something that really works for you.
Як головна вершниця цього каналу, звичайно, ти заслуговуєш похвали. Так, о! Що ми тут?
In this lesson, we're going to talk about art studies versus art creation, perhaps not even versus. What is the difference between these two things? Now, it's actually really important that we have a very clear idea in our mind what art studies are and what art creation is, because this is actually going to tie in to kind of our fear levels about art. And make no mistake, there is plenty of fear in creating art. Right, so art studies is artwork that we do to learn, right? Exercises,
Ти ще досі
sketches
з
in our
нею не
sketchbooks,
поговорив?
gesture drawings when we're at a coffee shop,
Це
you know,
явно
concept
питання, які
sketches
варто
and roughs
обговорювати саме в нас
before we
в
do the
чаті.
proper concept design sheets for a character and so on.
Багатофункціональний стрім.
That's what art
Сміяння.
studies are done for.
Приєднуйтесь.
They're done for our own selves, generally speaking. They're done to learn. They're done to observe things, to kind of make visual notes. That's what art studies are. And so, especially when you're doing art studies and exercises, I want to encourage you, please don't be afraid to draw or worry about what it looks like. It doesn't really matter what it looks like. What matters is that you're making good observational and visual notes on what you're doing. So that's what art studies are. Art creation, on the other hand, of course, is the creation of the main artwork, right? It's not created for learning, though you will learn things when you're creating stuff. But art creation is the process of
Насправді
creating
виникайте
a
мене
beautiful
такими
piece of art,
питаннями,
hopefully
навіть
an
що питання не до
appealing
мене.
piece of art.
Та ну, просто Емілі розповідала раніше, що в неї там цей, як його, як ця штука називається, ну ви поняли. Всі, хто пам'ятає, той знає. Але вона походу вже йшла. Емілі, ти ще тут? А.
With a good, strong story. So
Нахар,
just
я
a
тобі
quick
це
note,
все
just a quick
навіщо?
video on making sure in your mind you've got it very clearly divided. Art studies is one thing, art creation is another thing. And when you're working, make sure you know what you're doing. Am I doing a study or am I making art? If you're making art, you want to be in one mindset. And if you're doing studies, you want to be in a totally fearless other mindset.
Окей. Типу, ми просто вчимося. Ми зараз не створюємо вже якісь там величезні арт-проекти.
Let's
Ми
take a
просто
quick
вчимося
look
малювати.
at observational art and imaginative art, what the differences are, and also how they link
Промічки
together.
любові для Емілі.
So observational art is basically artwork that is done by observing something, recreating it on the page, and then kind of possibly adding your own twists to it, dramatizing it a little bit. But mainly the artwork is created by referencing something directly. Imaginative art, on the other hand, is done primarily out of your head, right? You're imagining things, ideas, places, characters, and so forth, and then trying to implement them onto the page. Now, imaginative art requires a lot of theory. You need to really have a firm grip on theory so that you know how to implement and also fix the imaginative artworks that you're creating.
Коротше, він пояснює, що на початку він все одно буде давати нам багато теорії, тому що навіть якщо ми хочемо вже займатися практикою, нам потрібна ця теорія, щоб правильно робити і щоб виправляти, якщо ми щось будемо в чомусь помилятися.
Observational art is extremely useful for imaginative artists, and this course is really about imaginative art, imaginative character art that is, because we use observation in our studies. When we're studying clothing, when we're studying posing, when we're studying anatomy, when we're studying hairstyles, observational art is a massive study tool for us. However, the observational art
Коли Нахарді не каже, для чого йому це все, я починаю думати, що він нам це все говорив вже, а я просто забула, бо я така неуважна до людей, які мені діляться своїми важливими питаннями в чаті. Це не треба так, я почуваюся тепер винною, не знаю, що з Нахарді відбувається, починаю переживати, починаю думати про те, яка я неуважна до своїх любимих модераторів, які тут страждають, їм для чогось потрібні шприци, а я навіть не в курсі.
isn't the actual art for us, and that is a very key point. So, in this course, we are firmly imaginative artists, but both imaginative and observational artists make use of references, whether the reference is visual information in your mind or visual information in front of you. And of course, there are definitely artists who use both, where they're mixing elements of reality with elements of imagination.
Полегшало трохи. Дякую, що повідомив.
Hey guys, and welcome to the summary video for Module 1. I know it was a very talky module, but you don't have to worry. The rest of the course is really about all the drawing practical things and not sort of the mental kind of theoretical things that you need to be thinking about. But nevertheless, let's summarize Module 1. Please take notes if you haven't started taking notes already, and let's get right into it.
Так,
So the
якщо ви
first
нічого
thing
не
we want to
записували,
just take a
починайте
quick look at
записувати.
is SFD, or shape, form, detail, and summarize that in our
Так,
three triangle
фігури,
structure.
форми,
Right.
деталі.
And shape being the biggest section, form, and then detail. And this first triangle is kind of
Заряджаю
art theory,
пушку промінчиками любові.
right? How we want to think about the theory of the structure of images,
Йой-йой,
art theory.
стільки не
And
цей.
also a good way to think
Не
about this
пристрій
is
мене ними, будь ласка.
how we
Не
think,
добивай, не
right? And by
добивай,
we
але
I
можеш
mean
поранити.
artists. How we think, right?
How we think. Як ми думаємо?
The second triangle is how we create art, right? So this is implementation theory. Implementation.
Так.
On my handwriting
Теорія
theory.
творчості, потім прикладна теорія, типу застосування цих знань.
And really this is that we want to engage in sort of shape let's put form here first. Form and shape thinking at the same time, and then doing the details later. And this is basically how we draw.
Так, спочатку як ми думаємо, потім як ми малюємо.
Alright.
І
And then,
третє,
last but
що
not
там мало
least,
бути,
this
як
is,
бачить результат нашої роботи.
how the viewer sees, right? How the viewer sees pieces, and how we look at art when we're in our appreciative mindset, when we're kind of looking at art that we admire. And it's kind of a 50-50 split between detail and form. The viewer doesn't really notice shape, right? And as we know, shape is extremely, extremely important. I'll re-emphasize, and as we go through the course, you'll realize why. Because shape has everything to do with composition, and it's sort of the hidden reason why artwork looks good, feels good, and communicates certain things. Right? And it even permeates into the form section in terms of light shapes and things like that. And so this is really how people see, right? How people see or view art. Okay. Probably things in life as well, but I don't want to get into that. Okay, so that is really our shape, form, and detail theory, and it really structures everything, also implies a workflow, which we'll look at later. So that's that. Okay, let's move this to the side. The next thing is technical skill versus emotional impact, right? So let's put a bubble here, and let's call this one emotional impact. And we'll put another bubble kind of slightly smaller here. Technical skill, right? And the summary of this really is that whilst in an ideal world, you'll want to have a 50-50 split, emotional impact will always be weightier than technical skill. And you definitely see this in a lot of children's books, and a lot of popular cartoons and things. They're very kind of flat, often lacking, but they have a huge emotional impact in the appeal of the structure of the artwork, which often outweighs any kind of technical criteria that they're not meeting. So let's always remember the emotional impact is very important. We want to make an emotional impact first when we're thinking and conceptualizing our characters, and then we want technical skill to try to communicate that to the viewer in the most effective way. Right? But a 50-50 would be ideal, that or 100-100 even, but a 50-50 split that you are getting the emotional impact and you're getting the technical skill, and then you should have a really great, well-balanced piece in that regard. All right. Let's move on to the story is everything, right? So I'm just going to write this really big here. Story is everything. All right. So once again, the story being everything is really that the story, the feeling, and the emotion, and the thing itself of the art, right? The concept of the art, the story of that concept, and how it makes people feel, what it communicates to people, the mood, the expression, and all of those things are everything when it comes to the artwork. This obviously does tie into emotional impact, and really the story is everything. If you have a great story, but it's got poor implementation, it's still a great story. Yes, maybe the implementation isn't great, but the story is still great. If you have a very poor story, poor feeling, poor mood, poor emotion, and great implementation, it seems like a dead piece. It seems like a good piece, like sort of in a technical way, but it's kind of dead, and it's not going to enamor anybody or compel them to look longer.
Я б на твоєму місці не вважала їх вище стоящими. В моєму особистому рейтингу ти далеко вище.
Alright, let's talk about believability versus realism. Now, this is not to say that we don't do realist art, or that we're trying to make our works appear to be in time, in space, in three-dimensionality. No, really, this section is just about having you understand that having a piece of art that is believable outweighs having a piece of art that is extremely realistic. Realistic doesn't equal good. Believability equals good. And the more believable the work is, and the more believable the story is, and the better the story is, and the feeling and the emotional impact, this all aids in the believability of a piece of artwork. You know, being super hyper real, and you've probably seen super hyper rendered 3D models of something. The model just looks dead, it looks static. Yes, it looks very real, but it doesn't look alive. And
ти
all
тут
of that
важливу
stuff
місію
comes from the
виносиш,
story, the
це
feeling, the
виконуєш.
emotion,
Так
the
що так,
believability that has been put into the piece of work. And so that's really what that section is about. Alright, let's move on to art studies and art creation. Right, so once again, art studies is really just drawings that we do with completely without fear, right? Completely without fear for learning, okay? We do
Art
these art
studies
studies
хіба
for
так
learning.
пишеться,
They are
а
the
не
sketches that we might do at a coffee shop. They're the observational drawings that we do in visual library development, which you'll learn coming up when we're trying to expand our visual library, when we're trying to just kind of understand the world better, observe the world, take reference from the world, and understand the designs better. They're art studies. I think I spelled that wrong. Studies, right? And really, I don't want you guys to stress about art studies. Just do the studies. It doesn't matter what it looks like. All that matters is that you're observing and that you're learning, right? And then art creation. And the reason that I make this very particular split between the two is that if you've got all these feelings of fear of good drawings and stuff when it comes to art studies, it's going to hinder your learning. You're not going to learn quickly because you're worried about it looking good. You're worried if you're a good artist. You're questioning yourself if you've got any skill or talent at all, if you should be doing this, and so on and so forth. We don't want that. It's messing with our learning speed and our learning progress, right? Now, art creation, yes, there's fear, but art creation really is making good art, right? Making good art. We do want it to look good. We do want it to have appeal, right? And we do want it to have a professional finish. And so it is different from art studies. And you want to learn
я
how
поки
to... Whoops, I was
залишаюся
thinking
на
about the word
цьому,
fear.
на
You
стадії
want to
art
learn how
studies.
to avoid being fearful in this stage. And one of the ways we avoid being fearful in art creation is having a solid workflow, right? Having a solid map, knowing what to do when we're creating our art. So when we do make mistakes or we are confused about what to do next, we have the map and we realize, okay, I need to do this, 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 or this can be fixed in this way, right? And then that removes the fear. I mean, a lot of the time, fear comes from not knowing, right? And so with art creation, we have workflows that help you to know exactly what you need to do. All right. And then last but not least, imaginative and observational art. So I'll use this little space at the top here. Imaginative art or imaginative realism, right? Let's call it imaginative realism, is artwork that we do from our imaginations, right? And observational art is pretty much a lot of the time the artwork that you see guys doing on street stalls on the street, copying photos, people copying photos of their family, people doing paintings of their family and little kids and people and things like that, and people just painting landscapes, you know, from the real world, plein air paintings as they call them. That's observational art, right? Observational art is in many ways significantly easier than imaginative realism, because in imaginative realism we need tons of theory, right? Tons of theory so that we can actually understand how to paint these things just without any reference.
Ну, це прикольний, типу, до речі, кейс, типу, що можна просто змальовувати все, що ви бачите, і це трошки легше, ніж якщо вам треба створювати щось своє, і при тому, щоб воно виглядало реалістичним. Щоб воно виглядало реалістичним, потрібна велика база теоретичних знань, якої поки в мене немає. Тому, знаєте, створювати своїх персонажів мені важкувато.
If we need to, right? And generally speaking, depending on the type of artist you are, you might work like that, right? And observational artists can really, to a large extent, they can just copy what's in front of them. And also that I think normal people, I say normal people, non-artists don't realize that, you know, observational art is actually fairly straightforward. All you really have to do is observe and recreate exactly what you've observed. Recreate the measurements, recreate the values, recreate the colors, the tones, or whatever the case may be, or the lines, or the edges, or the shapes that you're seeing. Just recreate them in the correct measurements from each other, in the right proportions from each other. And generally anybody can do this with, you know, a little bit of practice of just copying things, right? And we will be doing some observational art in visual library development in module 2, right, to help us learn and grow our visual libraries. Nevertheless, you can also get a hybrid of imaginative realism and observational art, where you know all the art theory and all the rules, and then you kind of use an observed thing like a person or a landscape, and you use the imaginative theory to add drama, to amp up and boost the observed world, and you're really going to dramatize what you're seeing. Nevertheless, this course is solidly in the imaginative realism territory, and obviously things like art for animation, pre-visualization, concept art for characters, stylized character designs, you know, manga art, comic art, and stuff like that. So imaginative realism, right? And we're going to be learning this tons of theory, at least in terms of character design.
Дякую, що ти в нас є.
That's about it for this summary video. Let's move on to module 2. I hope you're excited. It's going to be a really awesome module. Let's get started.
Так, що у нас тут? На-на-на. Шефіня, нам це не потрібно, йдемо далі. Котра година? О, якраз у мене 11, у вас 12. Давайте я ще піду на 15 хвилин на перерву. Завершу зі своїми справами по роботі, бо я там дещо закинула пектися. Перевірю, як воно в мене, в якому стані. Ще там дещо підготую до обіду і повернуся через хвилин 15, максимум 20. Поки що залишу вас з музичкою і відлучусь.
처음 만난 그날만 갈게 yeah. 소리 없이 타오르는 불꽃 같은 마지막처럼 내 입 맞추길 hey. 달빛 아래 내 맘은 설레는 낮수로 춤추러 갈래 let's go 시간 let go 오늘이 가도 후회 없게 시간이 우리 둘을 떼어놓을 수 없게 순간이 영원할 수 있게 넌 내 마음에 불을 질러줘 후회 없는 젊음이 타오르게 지금처럼 너와 함께라면 tonight I could die in this moment forever young forever young forever young forever young 매일 bomb 이 노래는 blah blah yeah we got that bomb come again forever young boy so we ride and die 끝이 없을 것처럼 달려 너와 나 붉은 sunset 아래 너는 지금 내 옆에 pink down and murdered out like it ain't a thing 다 필요 없어 주인공은 우리 say life's a bitch but mine's a movie 내 diamond처럼 we'll shine together whenever wherever forever ever ever 짜릿하게 더 위험하게 세상 저 끝까지 가볼래 let's go 지금 let go 오늘이 가도 후회 없게 시간이 우리 둘을 떼어놓을 수 없게 순간이 영원할 수 있게 넌 내 마음에 불을 질러줘 후회 없는 젊음이 타오르게 세상 무엇도 두렵지 않아 tonight I could die in this moment forever young Blackpink is the revolution 끝이 없이 달려보자 we like to let's go girls wanna have some fun we go dum 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 yeah girls wanna have some fun what you want girls wanna have some fun we go dum 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 yeah girls
scared of love. My shadow just walks beside me. I'm getting closer to the edge, but try hard not to lose myself. 마음이 혼자서 걸어갈 때 조용히 지켜 바라봐줘. 혹시 잊었던 시간의 소리가 그 맘에 닿을 수 있을지 몰라. I say I'm brave enough, brave enough to be myself, and there'll be a dawn after this long and dark night. And the morning brings me a story when I'm standing all on my own. Is there anybody out there? Just realized I'm still in my dream. 맘에 눈물을 보일 때도 모른 척 웃으며 감싸안아줘. 언젠가 머물던 내 안의 기억이 눈물을 닦아줄 수 있을지 몰라. 어느 날 문득 뒤돌아보니 그곳에 낯선 내가 있어. 말 없는 미소로 나를 보며 괜찮다고. I say I'm brave enough to be myself, and there'll be a down after this long and dark night. 벌써 봄이 왔네 꿈 같은 바람이 불어 곳곳에
여느 때와 다른 듯한 네 기분이 반가워 내일은 좀 다른 날이 되려나
어둠의 그림책 깊은 이 밤에 남겨진 다리 밝아와 빛을 그리고 있어
내 몸에서 너만큼 욕조에 물이 미련이 돼 넘쳐 흘러 한숨이 가득 그 공간을 채워 새벽이 찾아오면
혼자 남겨질 때면 Starry night 별이 빛나는 밤 네가 위 부러워 너와 나
나는 수많은 밤 나를 취하게 만들어 별이 빛나는 밤 별이 빛나는 밤
별이 빛나는 밤 겨울이 지나고 또다시 꽃은 피고 따뜻한 공기 냄새가 날 감싸
달라진 거 없는 똑같은 일상이 반복돼 그래도 내일을 기다려봐
하루의 끝에서 이 자리에 남았어 아니 새도록 나를 그리고 있어
Do you want me to live? No 난 그 자리 그대로 까만 밤 하늘에 가려 잠시 보이지 않는 거야 새벽이 찾아오면
혼자 남겨질 때면 Starry night 별이 빛나는 밤 네가 왜 부러워 너와 나
나는 수많은 밤 나를 취하게 만들어 별이 빛나는 밤 별이 빛나는 밤
별이 빛나는 밤 Starry starry night 네가 없는 밤 가슴이 공허
우리의 풍경이 저물어가 현실을 부정해 눈을 감아 또 네가 보여 왜 아른거려 Leave me alone 무너져가네
Starry night 별이 빛나는 밤 네가 왜 부러워 너와 나 나는 수많은 밤
나를 취하게 만들어 별이 빛나는 밤 별이 빛나는 밤
별이 빛나는 밤 덤덤해지네 아빤 한번 웃으면 걱정도 개가 사라진대 그곳에서 나는 다시 삶의 길을 찾아가네 당해 Ayo, ayo, you got me jumping like a crazy crown 뭐해 썩은 이빨 뽑아내야지 아야 세상을 다 줄 것처럼 말았고 이제 서로 화살을 겨눠 뻔하디 뻔한데 네 말고래 침을 뱉어 오점 하나 생겨 우린 남이 됐다 못된 사랑 놀이에 미쳐 이기적인 놈 이젠 지쳐 눈물인지 또 빗물인지 넌 내게 무력감을 줬어 눈물이 뚝 떨어진다 툭 떨어진다 눈물이야 아야 눈물이야 아야 눈물이 툭 들었던 너들 이제 그만해 넌 아니 어린애 아이야 꼴도 보기 싫어 I'm so done 너는 killer 영화 속 villain 사랑을 속이는 빌런 숨겨봤자 수면 위로 criminal 늦었어 이미 너 바라새는 내 손에 gone shot shot Ayo ayo you got me jumping like a crazy crown 뭐해 썩은 이빨 뽑아내야지 아야 못된 사랑 놀이에 미쳐 이기적인 놈 이젠 지쳐 눈물인지 또 빗물인지 넌 내게 무력감을 줬어 눈물이 뚝 떨어진다 나나나 단단단단단단 툭 떨어진다 눈물이야 아야 눈물이야 아야 눈물이 Line is over 끝났어 더 이상 못하겠어 남은 감정도 없어 이건 아니야 살던 돼 너만 내 잘못이야 눈물이 아야 툭 떨어진다 떨어진다 눈물이야 눈물이야 happy ending 떨어진다 눈물이야 눈물이야 처음이니까 떨어진다 아야 알람이 울려든 ring 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 서로의 눈길이 닿을 때마다 알면서 빙빙 도는데 점점 다가갔잖아 I know it's too late 마음속으로 나 다 알고 있잖아 결국에는 선을 넘게 될 거라는 걸 I'm warning to myself 막 그러면 안 돼 매번 맺혀 내 맘이 내 맘을 추월해 out of control 나를 감시하는 저 spot spot spotlight 비칠수록 어둠 속으로 빨려들어 끝이 보이는데 I know it's not right I can't stop me can't stop me 내 앞에 놓여진 이 red 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 light 건너편에 너와 난 이미 눈에 맞춰 느끼고 싶어 짜릿한 highlight I can't stop me can't stop me I can't stop me can't stop me 눈 그만 달라고 딱 한 번만 no rules 머리 잡히죠 lights off tonight 넌 참을 수 없을 것 같아 losing myself yeah yeah 이제는 turning back 불가능해 난 점점 더 깊은 너 눈에 눈을 짜릿해 난 눈을 감을래 다시는 돌아갈 수 없을 것만 Can't stop me, can't stop me, can't stop me. 나를 감시하는 저 spotlight. 빛일수록 어둠 속으로 빨려들어. 끝이 보이는데 I know it's not right. I can't stop me, can't stop me. 내 앞에 놓여진 이 red light. 건너편에 너는 이미 눈에 맞춰. 느끼고 싶어 짜릿한 highlight. I can't stop me, can't stop me.
Ну, що це я вже грала? Can't stop me, can't stop me. Ага. Боже, я на кінець прийшла, капець. Я просто з цього, як воно? З Дискорду писала, там же ж в мене не було музики, я не бачила, що ви тут під класний музончик зависаєте, поки мене нема. Так, привіт, Айрис, привіт всім, хто прийшов, поки мене не було. Ось вам промінчики любові, бачу, глядачів назбиралося купа. Мене нема навіть в кадрі, а ви тут дивитесь, непонятно що. Як завжди, вам цікавіше, коли мене немає. Ну ладно. Сорі всім, хто прийшов музичку послухати, а я вас позбавляю цієї можливості. Рада бачити у будь-якому випадку. Неочікувано багато глядачів для мого каналу. Поки ви не розбіглися, хоч подякую вам за те, що ви тут. Так, я поки що перейду в режим. Що ми на правилах дивились, так? Значить, перший модуль ми пройшли, переходимо до модуля номер 2. Тут у нас буде розігрів і penmanship. Не знаю, що таке penmanship, треба собі перекласти слово. О, Нахарі, ти ще все ще тут. Зараз, де мій? Без поняття просто, що це означає? Перо? Блін. Прикольно, вивчила нове слово. Оскільки тут буде багато якоїсь внутрішньої лексики, типу специфічної, відповідно, багато слів я не буду знати, я буду їх собі заодно перекладати, так що буде в нас навчальний в усіх сенсах цього слова стрім. Не знаю, скільки ми за сьогодні пройдемо, тут я бачу деякі завдання по 7, 12, 12, 5, 7, 8, 4, ну навряд чи ми пройдемо весь модуль. Так що пройдемо декілька завдань, я планую найближчих годину, максимум півтори на це потратити. І мені там далі треба буде з обідом рішати все. І якщо що, нагадую всім, що вчора ми почали дивитися нову дораму «Потяг». Ми вже глянули 2 серії, тому вони є ще в записі. Якщо ви не дивилися, але хочете продовжити дивитися і далі з нами, подивіться обов'язково перші серії. І далі будемо продовжувати разом дивитися. До речі, я теж зараз малюю. Ну, я не малюю, я просто дивлюся курс по малюванню, але побачимо. Так, музику треба тихіше зробити. Так, набагато тихіше я зроблю музику, тому що у нас тут основний курс. Що ж, розминка для розігріву для малювання, типу.
Welcome to module 2, and at the start of this module we're going to be doing warm-up and penmanship training. I'm going to show you a warm-up exercise that is really designed to help you improve your penmanship, how you basically draw lines and how you can basically get a good way to loosen up, draw with your arm, and it's a great exercise. You can do it digitally, you can do it traditionally, it doesn't really matter. So let's get right into it. So the first stage of this is to really just draw a page of circles. And notice how fast I'm drawing them. I'm kind of keeping my wrist kind of locked and using my arm and my elbow to draw these. So all you have to do is basically say, okay, let me draw
Тобто малюємо коло,
circles without
рухаючи
moving
лише
my wrist.
пальцями.
And I also want you to pay careful attention to how loose I'm being. You can
Щоб
see that here
зафіксувати це і
and
просто
here and here and all these areas, the circles don't necessarily close properly. Now, you want to strive to have good, perfect circles, as perfect as possible, but not at the expense of drawing slowly, right? Or anything like that. We don't want to draw slowly. We don't want to do anything like that. Right.
треба швидко.
So
Раз,
just
раз,
be very
раз,
loose,
коло,
lock your
коло.
wrist,
Легко,
and move your arm
просто.
and
Коло,
do
коло,
a page
коло,
of
раз,
circles.
коло, два.
Right. I'll try and be as perfect as I can here.
Поки що все мені вдається. Непогано, непогано. Я вшарюю.
Right. And what I'll often do is just put circles in the circles, smaller circles. Not using my wrist, once again, don't use your wrist.
Ще раз уточнюю, не використовуємо все зап'ястя, а лише різці з зап'ястя, напевно. Просто
So that's
суть
what
в тому,
we
що
want to
рухати
do as
тільки
the first
пальцями.
exercise. Add a new layer or get a new page. And what we want to do after that is draw some
Бачите, я
ellipses.
все
Now, what is an
вшарюю.
ellipse? An ellipse is a circle that, if rotated slightly, is now in perspective, right? So
Да,
it's basically
ellipse.
still the same circle,
Годі.
it's the same little, let's pretend it's a
Ellipse я
dish, for
можу.
example, right? We've just rotated in perspective, that's what an ellipse is. And you know your ellipses are good if you can cut them down the middle here. This is called the
Тобто,
minor
якщо
axis.
еліпс ви посередині можете
Or
провести
your theory
лінію, і
nerds out
вони
there.
з обидвох
Oops,
боків
what am I saying?
однакові,
I'm
то
gonna
це
type minor
значить, ви
theory.
вмієте
Minor
малювати еліпси.
Right? If you cut it through the
У мене
middle,
поки що так не
right, on the minor
виходить.
axis, the major axis is not important to us, that would be cutting it vertically, and you're able to fold one side over the other, and they match fairly well or perfectly, right? This one's pretty okay. Also a point to note, just as a side note, the minor axis will always point to a vanishing point in perspective if you know a lot about perspective, right? Nevertheless, what we want to do is a page of ellipses and just kind of get that arm motion of drawing ellipses.
Так, малюємо цілу сторінку еліпсів. Це ми розігріваємося, якщо хтось не поняв, для чого ми це все робимо. Перш ніж почати
And you
малювати,
can
треба
vary the
розігріти руку.
degree of the ellipse. That is
Справжні
the
майстри так і
spacing in
роблять.
between the ellipse. So what
Підозрюю, що
degree of
ні.
rotation is happening to the circle. So you can do very thin little ellipses, or you can try to do kind of bigger ellipses. The whole thing is to ensure that both sides really are the same as each other. Right. And what you can do after you've done a page of ellipses is just run through and check them and just put a tick or a cross if you felt it was a good ellipse or a bad ellipse. Right, that one's not super good. This one's reasonable. This one's reasonable too. Bad. This one's okay. That one's bad. And once again, I want to reinforce loose. Just be loose, physically loose in your arm, right? Now, a lesson coming up called looseness and
Пройти.
dynamism
Гарного
will
тобі дня.
really go
Якщо що,
in
ми завжди
depth
тобі раді.
as to what
Приходь,
it
коли
means to be
захочеш.
loose in terms of physically loose in your arm. So that is coming up, but nevertheless, I want you guys to start doing the warm-up exercises already. All right, not super good on the ellipses, no big deal, it's just a warm-up exercise. All right, the next thing that you guys should do on the warm-up exercise and penmanship training is really draw straight lines as straight as you can, freehand,
лінії.
very
Моя
quickly,
улюблена
not
частина.
slowly at all,
Швидко, не
and try and keep
повільно,
them as parallel as possible.
щоб вони були паралельно, якомога паралельніше одна до одної.
This is especially useful when you're trying to do obviously straight lines in your work, if you're doing any kind of industrial design drawing. And I would just generally do this a couple of times, top to bottom, bottom to top. Just doing my best, putting the lines in very
Старайся,
quickly.
я
You can
теж
see how
стараюся
quickly
тут.
I'm drawing this. Locking my wrist and trying to get as straight a line as possible. You can see here I kind of veer. The lines are not perfectly parallel. They taper a little bit. Tapering. They're kind of converging, heading to converge somewhere. But it's a great exercise, and I'd probably just do about 3 pages, 2 or 3 pages, where I'm just constantly training my arm, moving it quickly. And you'll see the more you get it and the more you focus, the better you get as time goes by. And I usually do one of these entire exercise workflows, warm-up exercises, in about 5 minutes just before I start drawing, and it helps to really loosen up the arm, because getting nice smooth lines really requires a
Як у
looseness,
мене виглядають
physical
мої
looseness.
smooth lines.
Okay. And then, last but not least, is the point-to-point
Жах, який,
exercise.
правда?
The
Здавалося,
point-to-point
так легко
exercise
він це
really
робить.
is, you put about 6-7 dots on the page, and what you want to try and do is
Недавно.
ghost the line if you have to. Let me make the cursor a little bit bigger here so you can see. So kind of,
А, тепер
you
треба
want to try
точки
and have a straight
поз'єднувати.
shot, as straightest line as possible,
Секунду.
joining.
Тож мені теж треба попрактикуватися. Як воно тут вичистити все? Attexit. Не то. Не пам'ятаю, давно я вже не користувалася. Ах, де тут видаляється все? Не, це замало, це заповільно. Окей, візьмемо новий. Ні, що я мала робити? Точки. Це не точка була, ну ок. І потім, типу, одною лінією з'єднати точки. Бачите, я навіть не можу їх з'єднати. Давненько просто не практикувалася в цій фіні. Як все запущено. Вообще по точках не попадаю. Які ще точки можна з'єднати? Сюди точку. Отже, мені, як це дуже багато всього ще треба буде навчитися робити. Просто з'єднувати точки, ви думали, що це просто, це ніфіга не просто. Береш, ой, я не попадаю, ой, знов щось не попало, ой, щось знов не попало, ой, знов не попало. Точка, з'єднали. Та блін, та що, воно не попадає і все. Шикарно. Мені здається, це можна вже продати як витвір мистецтва сучасного. Назвемо це вільне мистецтво абстракцій. Ху. Блін, тут десь була така штука, що повністю видалити. Це і... не. Ти просто переробити, та не може бути. Я пам'ятаю, що я якось це все видаляла. Ні. Тут на що? О, clear. Мені оце більше подобається. Ні, це не то, що мені подобається. А що мені подобається? Коли широко, файно. Тут просто меню помінялося за ті часи, що я ним не користувалася, і відповідно все по-інакшому. Можливо, це можна якось налаштувати, але я без поняття. Значить, ще пробуємо поз'єднувати точки. Хай вони будуть ближче, бо точки, які далеко, я не вмію з'єднувати. Типу ті, що близько зараз, ну, з Богом. От, блін. Ні. Ти ж. Ха. Ха. Це такий медитативний, до речі. Ладно, я помалювала, я зрозуміла, що я не вмію малювати, давайте на цьому і закінчимо. Так, тихо, бо в мене щось працює з ручкою тільки на один екран. І мені треба окремо брати. Йо, як це все складно. Тепер мишка щось глюкає. Ви всі повтікали, бо взагалі ніхто нічого не пише, типу, ніяк, ні що. Ви захоплені моїм скілом, я знаю, це просто ви втрачаєте всі, як його, здатність говорити від захвату. Розумію, не кожного дня майстер перед вами свою творчість показує. Що у нас там ще можна поробити? Це в мене скрипить. Так, йдемо далі по курсу. Розігрілася я, значить.
These 2 points together. And so I ghost the line. Basically, I don't draw, I kind of just hover my hand to try and make the shot. And then try and go for it. Didn't quite hit it, but the line's
Просто
pretty nice and
подивіться, як
straight.
це роблять ті, хто
And
вміє
then
це
I'll try the
робити.
next one. Now, if you're on paper, feel free to rotate the page. Photoshop, you can hit R, and you can then rotate the page like that, because I find that I draw straight lines reasonably accurately from bottom to top. Ghosting, trying to hit it.
Бо ж, оце прям важко.
So here I will ghost this one as well. Okay, hit it, but I overshot a little
Треба
bit.
розібратися,
But the
як
line's
це
fairly straight.
робиться в фотошопі.
And the
Я не
overshoot's
вмію
on the
цим
end of the
тулом
world. You're really
користуватися.
just trying to train yourself to draw very straight lines. Okay, and that one's pretty reasonable. Right. So in summary, the workflow for the warm-up and penmanship training, and I recommend you do this every day before you start to draw, is do a page of circles very loosely, a page of ellipses very loosely. Don't forget to measure them down the middle to check their accuracy. A page of lines, straight lines, or 2 or 3 pages if you wish, if you're pretty quick at it. And then a single page of point to point where you want to connect the lines together with as
Значить,
straight a
щоб
line as possible. Connect
розігрітися,
the
перш
points
ніж
together
почати
with
малювати,
a straight
треба
line
малювати
as possible.
сторінку кіл,
That's the end of
сторінку
this lesson.
еліпсів,
Let's move on to the
одну-дві
next lesson.
сторінки цих рисочок, а потім ще точки поз'єднувати. І ви готові до малювання.
In this lesson, we're going to look at drawing in 3D and drawing through forms. And
Так,
we
через
are
форми в
realist
3D.
artists, so we are drawing things in such a way that they can be believed to exist in a 3D world. And as such, we need to move our minds away from drawing simple shapes, right? And instead toward drawing forms, right? Where the viewer can perceive multiple sides of an object, right? So in this example here, we've taken this squarish shape and added some sides to it. So now we have a front, a side, and a bottom view of the object. And it is much more believable looking three-dimensional in a sense, right? Even if it's very simplistic 3D. So drawing in 3D helps us convince the viewer and persuade the viewer of the believability of what we're drawing. Now this method I've kind of done here is kind of a shorthand for getting something to look 3D very quickly. You can take any simple shape and add an additional line to it, and it gives it the perception that it has multiple planes, right? Multiple sides. So on the circle, this might be a button. We've turned the circle into a button by giving it a front view and a side view. You can also use this method for other objects, multiple objects really, such as a rock. No one would viably believe that this is a rock. However, if we take this particular shape and we simply give another line to it, for example through here, now we're kind of indicating additional planes, right? That the viewer can see more sides of the object. Let's argument say that's the front and the side. And when you then detail these types of shapes a little bit more, they become quite convincing in their portrayal of what they're supposed to be. So I'll kind of erase the line a little bit, put a little shape there, a dot, some dots, and maybe give it another little plane. And it becomes, you know, a fairly convincing, if slightly cartoonish looking rock. So this is a simplistic method where you're simply saying to yourself, I don't want shapes in my piece. I want forms. And so you're taking simple shapes that you may be drawing and just adding additional planes to them, right? Bringing them into a 3D world. Okay, so that's kind of the first basic way that you can understand how to move from someone who perhaps sticks to very 2D flat looking work, how you can kind of start bringing that work into the 3D realm. But I wanted you guys to know this, but this is not the primary way I want us to think about drawing in 3D. The primary way I want us to think about drawing in 3D is what is called drawing through or drawing through forms, right? So in the real world, there really aren't such things as 2D flat shapes per se. Everything's 3D to some extent, right? You know, even stickers, you know, stickers are completely flat, but, you know, if you look at them with a microscope, you'll see that they do have width, height, length, and so on, and they are three-dimensional. Nevertheless, drawing through forms is really imagining the other sides of the object as you attempt to draw it. So over here, I'm imagining the other sides of this box, and drawing these elements in helps me feel out all the different sides of the box. So here we can see all 6 sides of the box. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the front one, 6, right? So we can imagine all 6 sides of the box. And similarly with spheres as well, you know, this is just a circle, but by drawing a contour line, and this would be done in your construction phase, right? It helps us as the artist to feel out the three-dimensionality of the object that we're drawing. So you can add contour lines on the surface of objects as well as drawing through the forms to help you figure out the volumetric kind of mass of the object, or at least how the object feels in 3D, right? Not the exact mass, obviously. And a very popular shape for drawing through and helping you, especially in character art, is the simple cylinder. So to draw a cylinder effectively, I draw 2 ellipses, kind of connect them, and this would be the background drawn through line. And when I do the final clean drawing, I'll only keep the sides that I want to see, right? So it would be that bottom section and that top section. But, so let's just say this is the bottom, and let's just say this is the top. But drawing through has helped me establish a convincing outer edge here, because I've used an ellipse to guide me. And so I have a really appealing 3D cylinder shape, all right? And when we start adding dynamism to this, which we'll look at in the next lesson, so we take a cylinder and then we add some dynamism to it, we can start getting much more complex forms. So here are some contour lines to help us understand, and I've drawn through the shape. So here we can basically see both entrances to the horn. It looks like some kind of horn, right? And so that's possibly going down. But ultimately, these contour lines help us imagine the form. So this is effectively what drawing through is. You're drawing through forms. You're imagining objects in 3 dimensions. Now let me say this. There are very few things that are really going to push your brain as much as trying hard to kind of, especially if you're a beginner, move away from this 2-dimensional idea of drawing and forcing yourself to think sculpturally, in a sense, and to think about forms of objects or basic shapes that you want to draw, basic 3D shapes. And you really have to get your mind around this. And it does take some practice, although it doesn't take too much time. If you're doing the practice exercises, you start getting used to it. And the great thing is, when you can imagine multiple sides of an object, right, when you start thinking in 3D and also looking at the world around you and imagining all the planes and all the different sides of objects, right, getting a deeper view of observing the world, you're then able to easily rotate objects around in the virtual space of the page. So take a cylinder, for example. Let's just assume this is us directly looking at the cylinder from the bottom, front on view. And on that note, front views and direct side views are things we do not want in art. Let me reiterate that. We do not want direct front on views. We do not want direct side on views unless they're specifically being designed for the purposes of blueprinting or, you know, character spec sheets or something like that. But generally speaking, for an appealing piece of artwork, you don't want a direct front or side view, especially in illustrative work. But nevertheless, this is our cylinder. It doesn't look like much of a cylinder right now. Let's rotate the cylinder slightly to the right, just slightly. So what I'm doing is I'm drawing through here, and this has become an ellipse. Can't be a circle anymore because it's rotating in perspective slightly. And through drawing through, I've rotated the cylinder slightly to the right, slightly to the left, mind you. So it's rotated that way. We've moved it that way. Let's do more of an extreme rotation, and I'm going to draw through again, And here is me rotating the cylinder to even more of an extent left. All right. And eventually we'll probably end up with a side view that looks something like this. Right, like that would be a direct side view. And we've continuously rotated it. And we can then take that further and basically do the opposite of number 2 here. And rotate it even more left. And that will have us have our cylinder kind of going backwards now. All right. And that's not quite as right as it should be, but nevertheless, it has rotated even more in that direction. And then we can kind of bring it back to a slightly, just a very slight rotation. Looks a little bit strange, but nevertheless. And as we're doing this, we're drawing through the forms, except for the side view. I mean, don't really need to draw through that one. It's the direct side view, same as the front view. And we are getting a sense of the dimensions of the object, right? Just putting this dot on the side to help us kind of feel out the planes that we're seeing as this cylinder rotates. Right, so effectively that's what drawing through is. The concept is pretty straightforward, right? The concept is pretty straightforward. But to get it ingrained in your brain is going to take some practice, especially if you've never done this before. Alright, I'm going to do a cube here one more time, or a box, let's just say a box. And basically I'm just drawing through, I'm imagining all the sides, and I'm just connecting them together. Another key thing, before we end this lesson, another key thing to realize is that all of the complex forms, you know, you imagine arms, you imagine legs and hands and feet, and these things just seem immensely complex, and there's anatomy and there's skin surface and muscles and skeletal systems to take into account and so on. But really, fundamentally, most of these things are really just made of boxes, they're made of cylinders, and various kind of triangular forms, but very basic triangular forms. They're not made of anything super complex. And what we do as artists, as realist artists, is we have a workflow that we follow, a structural workflow that we follow to build things from shape into form, into details. And that is how we get our completed rough, which we can then refine up to a completed piece of work. So we use these kind of basic types of shapes, whether it's any type of cuboid shape, any types of cylindrical shapes. For example, we may bend the cylinder as well to get certain limbs, right? But still drawing through to feel that form, putting contour lines on top of it to feel the forms out if we need to. We're not perceiving it well enough, right? Using spheres to connect joints and other things and to draw heads, for example. You might draw a cranium as a sphere, then attach a jaw section to it, right? So we're constantly thinking about forms and drawing through the forms and imagining the volume and the mass of the forms. Alright, so that's drawing in 3D and drawing through forms. Please definitely engage hardcore into these particular exercises, because once you get this, the basic foundations of drawing in 3D will be instilled in you. That's the end of this lesson.
Yoo-hoo!
In this lesson, we're going to take a look at looseness and dynamism in character drawing. And this theory really forms part of shape. So you want to think about this in terms of the shape category. Alright, so you may have found that when you're drawing something, it may tend to look very stiff and kind of may lack dynamism just in its feel, right? And so there are two kind of categories that I want to talk about and want to teach you. That the one would be looseness and the other is dynamism, okay? And they're both applied in different ways. So let's talk about looseness first, alright? So looseness is very physical. So let's just write some notes here. Looseness, and I'll put dynamism on the other side. Okay. Looseness is about physicality, okay? And what I mean about that is literally your arm. physicality. And dynamism is about movement and flow in shapes. Okay, so that's the basic theory of it. Okay, let's stick to the looseness side. So when you're drawing physical lines, like when you're physically drawing lines, when you draw lines slowly, so for example, I'll draw a line slowly here. Okay. Versus when I draw a line quickly, there is a fundamental difference between the two lines. Now, apart from straightness, right, that's the
В
obvious
моєму
difference.
випадку немає
The
різниці.
one line has direction.
Демонстрація. Так, тут ми маємо закінчити. Де воно? Є. Це я повільно малюю. Це я швидко малюю. Ну ладно, трошки є різниця. Окей. Ок. Ви мене переконали.
And the other line sort of doesn't. So if you kind of look at the ends of this line over here, it kind of just ends first of all. And second of all, because of its sort of wonky path, because I've drawn it slowly, it doesn't really appear like it's going anywhere. It seems very static, right? So this would be bad, right? We want loose lines. So in terms of looseness, what we have is a taper on each end, all right? And then a kind of a more arced appearance of the line, whether it's more or less straight, it doesn't matter. It's just very smooth. And what this means is that loose lines, and that therefore lines drawn quickly, they have a sense of directionality. So the lines seems to be moving this way and that way. Even more so when you start having curved lines drawn loosely, right, versus
Дякую за фоллоу.
curved lines kind of drawn
007.
slowly. While you have now achieved a sense of directionality in the slower line because of the curve, right, you still lose the directionality at the end tapers. And then also these kind of little bumps and nooks and crannies along the way kind of disrupt the viewer's understanding of the flow of the line, right? Versus obviously
Подай тебе.
these kind of
Є.
the
Я ж хочу попробувати. Що там було? Тоді. Тяжко мені, тяжко.
flow of the line, right? Versus obviously these kind of beautiful tapers that you have on faster drawn lines and just a really smooth flow, an uninterrupted sort of communication. Okay. So looseness is about drawing loosely physically. Now, you may have heard advice about people saying, you know, draw with your arm, don't draw with your wrist. And this is good advice, right? So definitely try and draw with your arm more for the bigger shapes. But of course, smaller shapes, you're going to need to use your wrist. But the idea is that you don't kind of pander to the lines in a way where you're kind of like, you know, hyper sketching like this, which this is called chicken scratch lines. You know, you don't want to draw
Chicken
like
scratch.
that. I mean, and nor do you want to draw really
Як
slowly
куркалапою.
like this,
Напевно.
because you're losing dynamism, right? Well, sorry, you're losing looseness in the lines. You want to
Якщо
really
дуже
just kind of
повільно,
like
то, типу,
be as quick as you
недбалість,
can. I'm using shift key there, but it
нелегкість.
doesn't
Я
really
не знаю, як
matter.
правильно перекласти в
And
даному
yes,
контексті
whilst you are having
loose.
these overlaps, the shape
Типу,
feels more dynamic overall, right? And more
Дехто
appealing and
коли так
also
потрібен.
more professional looking. And that is one of the ways that people get a professional look in their work. It's by having very loose strokes. Now, incidentally, this also applies to painting, although depending on how you're painting, not necessarily the tapering part, but just being loose, physically loose. Okay, so when we talk about looseness, we're talking about physical looseness in your arm. And one of the key tenets of that really is drawing fast, okay? So just going to write it down here. Draw fast or faster, right, if you're not that fast. Draw faster. And
Окей.
really kind of be loose. It can be hard to understand, but it's basically be physically loose. Okay, so
Типу,
be loose,
не дуже там.
draw faster. Okay, that is basically the
Старайся.
theory of looseness. It's not hard to do, but you're going to need to practice this. So there will be practice exercises for looseness. Okay. Dynamism, on the other hand, is a completely different topic. It's not got to do with physicality. It's got to do with theory and understanding the difference between something that is static and something that is moving. All right. And just take that away. It's bugging me. Okay. So when we're talking about dynamism, right? I'll give you an example. Let's draw a triangle. Let's just pretend this is a perfectly symmetrical triangle, right?
Окей.
If I had to ask you what the directionality is in this triangle, you would probably say, well, it seems to be pointing out in all of these different directions, right? Which, you know, technically speaking, if that is indeed the case, it's not moving anywhere. It's kind of just staying here. There's kind of its center of motion, if you will. Or it's, you know, it's not really moving here. It's static. However, we took the triangle and we gave it a definitive direction, right? And notice how I've curved these sides, right? But more than that, we've given this triangle a definitive direction. It's definitely moving in that way. That shape has gone from being static, right, to a shape that has flow or movement. Some people will use the word energy, or, you know, it's got a kinetic.
Та яка різниця,
Energy,
як ти це
right.
напишеш, все одно ніхто не
Now, you might be
розбере.
thinking, well, this is insane. How does this even apply to character drawing? So bear with me here. When you think about a character, a well-drawn character, in, say, a 3/4 angle, so they're not facing the camera front or side, they're kind of slightly rotated. The shapes that make up that character are largely asymmetrical. In fact, most of the time they're all going to be asymmetrical. And asymmetrical basically means that though while we understand, say, human beings being symmetrical from left to right, for example, that when they're put into perspective and rotated, there is no symmetry in the shape. So understanding particularly that we want to have all of our shapes, our basic shapes, to read in this way, that they have directional flow, is extremely important. So let me give you a brief example. Let's use a cube. Let's say we decide, and we'll do this more in the anatomy section, so you'll see me doing it there. Let's say we decide, okay, we want to have some basic building blocks for the form of a human, right? So we say, okay, we're going to make the chest a block like this, right? So we're going to make it a square. So if you can imagine with me, you know, we might draw the head, and that's a bit weird proportionally, but anyway. And then we might draw some joints for the arms and have some spheres for the arms and stuff. But anyway, bear with me. We're going to, this is like the Hulk here. But anyway, we're going to have this square. So we decide, okay, we're going to use this cube, sorry, as our base for the chest. That's all good and well, because we're getting the forms down. We can see that there are 3 sides to this cube, and that's great. But the problem is that this form now, right, lacks directionality in its shapes. So when you look at its shapes, which would be its different sides, there is no directionality. Now, don't get me wrong, don't hear me wrong here. I don't want you guys to build the forms in a way where you're kind of trying to turn each side into a directional shape. That would be weird. No. What you want to rather do is take that form, okay, and kind of start bending the form overall. Okay, so like you're curving the sides and you're kind of adding bend to its sides. Okay, here we're going to see the bottom of it instead of the top, but nevertheless the same thing applies. And you're getting a kind of a directionality, a directional movement through the form because you're bending the sides and you're adding movement to it. All right. And this is what dynamism means and what dynamic shapes mean, that you're ingesting life into these shapes. Now, you might say to yourself, well, where does this apply? Does this apply only to living things? Generally speaking, in the natural world, I would say definitely. And when I say living things, I don't just mean things that can move. It applies to trees, plants, anything that's alive, really, has some kind of directional flow. You know, things like mountains and things, you do want them to have directional flow in them because they were formed in some way via energy, right? I know that's kind of a bit weird, like esoteric and a bit out there, but nevertheless, the idea is that to a viewer, when they're seeing static shapes, it seems dull and without life. When they're seeing dynamic shapes, right, it seems to be alive, it seems to be moving, like there's life there, like there's motion. Okay, so let's just write here dynamic shapes and static shapes. So the idea is that you want to make sure in your art 99% of the time you're working with dynamic shapes all the time. Now, obviously this will differ if you're doing sort of a direct front view of a car, for example. You'll still want dynamic shapes, but obviously they're going to be mirrored left to right. You know, same thing with the side view. Granted, the side view generally has no parallels, no mirroring in it. But hopefully you understand this concept of dynamism. And we're going to be talking about this a lot as we move through, and you'll see how dynamism defines how we're going to draw all of our forms, right? We're going to make sure everything is dynamic all the time. Now, obviously, this is a character design course, so we're going to really be focusing and doubling down on how dynamism applies character design. And if you think of your typical human being, apart from when we're sleeping, although even when we're sleeping, but typically we're always moving, we're always balancing and counterbalancing, we're always experiencing the force of gravity and fighting against the force of gravity. And that then allows inside of us, we have this idea, what am I saying? What that means is that we have energy and directional flow moving in us all the time, balancing, counterbalancing, and so we need to, as artists, draw dynamic shapes all the time, right? So I want you guys to think about dynamic shapes and understand what makes the shape dynamic is that it has a directional flow to it, right? So for example, just a square, just reiterating here, this has no directional flow, but if we kind of bend the square in a weird way, suddenly it gains directional flow and it's more interesting to look at. Okay, that's it for looseness and dynamism. Let's move on.
Наче все зрозуміло.
In this lesson, we're going to be talking about tangents. And what tangents really are when lines touch each other and prevent the viewer from distinguishing what is in front or what is behind. Or it creates a really kind of weird looking shape to them. So I'm going to use a very familiar shape here. Perhaps it looks like an M or a logo of a popular food franchise.
Okay.
Let's assume that these are supposed to be two mountains. Because of the way the lines touch in the center here, it's very difficult to tell what is in front and what is behind, right? We don't know. But when we use overlap of the lines, and we take one line and have it overlap another, suddenly to the viewer, it becomes quite obvious that this must be in front and this must be behind. So tangents are any instance where objects touch each other in such a way as to create a single shape, or should I say where lines touch each other in such a way as to create a single shape and make it unclear to the viewer the spatial positioning of elements or lines, if you wish, right, or edges. So in this instance, these are two pieces of paper, and let's give them some text. And perhaps it's an open book seen directly from the top or something like that, but let's assume it's two pieces of paper and one is definitely in front and one is definitely behind. To the viewer, their brain is going to see this entire rectangular shape, not even the smaller rectangles inside. They'll eventually get there, but their first understanding of the shape is really this large rectangle. And our problem here are these two tangents, right? We can't tell what is in front and what is behind. But if we start overlapping certain lines, we can get a very convincing effect to add depth, even in very flat 2D kind of iconographic designs like these pages. So now that I've overlapped some lines, it's very clear which page is in front and which page is behind. And so the things that we're dealing with are that really that tangents are bad. Okay, tangents are bad. And overlaps are good. It seems, I think, a very simple concept, but often I see this in student work where really just something as simple as not having a line overlap causes things to look flat and to be easily misunderstood by the viewer. Let's change our headline here to tangents and overlap. Right, so that we're pretty clear about what we're talking about. So the great thing with overlaps, let me take this away. The great thing with overlaps is that overlaps can imply depth and create a sense of depth. So for example, if I were drawing a leg with a knee at the bottom. So this is just a leg design here. As I get to the knee section, I ensure that the knee lines overlap the back of the leg, and this gives me a sense of form. Right, so because of these overlapping lines are occurring here. It can happen in many different ways. In simple forms, if I have a sphere and then I draw a cube behind it, and then I draw a cylinder behind that. Whilst I am thinking in a form sense, I also know that these overlaps of these lines help the viewer to distinguish what is in front and what is behind. And so here we have the line of the sphere overlapping the cube form, and the lines of the cube clearly overlapping the cylinder form. And this is, in a nutshell, what overlapping lines are. They're lines that simply overlap. They extend slightly past the other object to show that the object is in front. Let me say this, it's something we want to be very intentional about. You want to constantly ask yourself, do I have any tangents? And if you do have tangents, you need to be like a sniper and eliminate them. They need to go, because tangents really have no place in our art. This is the lesson on tangents and overlaps and the importance of overlaps. Let's move on to the next lesson.
Так, що в нас наступне? Асиметрія. Асиметричність.
Alright, in this lesson we're going to look at parallels. And what are parallels? Why do we need to know about parallels? Why do we need to avoid parallels? Etc, etc. Right? So, parallels really, and I think I like the double L here, it's a good memory tool, really are parallel lines when you're drawing, or in terms of the visual communication of a piece, even the symbolic communication of a piece, parallels can also be parallel objects. For example, you know, a character's standing and their arm position, even though it's at a 3/4 angle, their arm position is basically the same on both sides. So this is a visual parallel. Sometimes this is called mirroring. And then parallels are also equal numbers of objects in a piece. So for example, you have a scene and there are some trees in the background. If you have 2 trees, that's considered parallel, and it just feels too balanced. And balanced in a bad way. It feels too engineered, right? So there's like sort of 2 trees in the background. And so what we want to be constantly doing in our work is making sure that we are breaking the parallels, right? So obviously, what is the opposite to a parallel? Well, it would be something that converges, right? And in this instance where we've got these 2 lines next to each other that are quite parallel, the difference between this parallel and the converging lines is that the converging lines have a sense of directionality, right? They have a sense of directionality. Now, that's in terms of a literal parallel, where maybe you've drawn a leg, for example. Let's kind of imagine I'm drawing a leg here, and I've made the lines on both sides of the leg, even though there's directionality in these lines. This is a literal parallel between the actual shapes, if you wish, or the lines, so that they're really mirroring each other and creating parallels. This fits more into the mirroring category. Let's say here 1 is a literal parallel, literal. 2 is mirroring. And then 3 is, I'd say this is more symbolic. Okay, it is actually symbolic parallel. This is mirroring, although this is technically not literal mirroring, because literal mirroring would then be, a front view, and you have this really literal symmetry that you're seeing in the piece. Okay. Nevertheless, in general, I'm sure you'll start getting the idea of what a parallel is. Not just in character art, in all kinds of art. You have 2 mountains in the background of a piece, and, they're kind of dividing the page equally like this. Something like that. It's very distracting, too balanced, awkward, too engineered for the viewer. So we want to avoid parallels at all times. We hate parallels. Parallels must not be in our piece. Whether they're literal parallels, whether they're symbolic parallels. For example, another example of symbolic parallels is, let's say you're drawing a character and the character's wearing a shirt, and you might think, well, this is crazy. Like, how can he say what he's about to say? Well, you'll see. Let's say he's wearing a shirt here. It's a collared shirt. It's a nice collared shirt. And you're putting the buttons down the shirt. I'm saying definitely don't put 8 buttons. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, maybe 8's a little hectic. Let's bring that number down to 6, right? I would say definitely don't do 6 buttons. Do 7 or 5, right? Because odd numbers are more interesting. And because odd numbers can't be divided equally, they are not paralleling each other in a sense, right? In a symbolic way. And so the piece feels more natural. There's a saying, I don't know where the saying comes from, so I do apologize. There's a saying that goes, God doesn't draw in straight lines. So things that are natural, they just aren't straight, they aren't balanced, they aren't mathematically equal to them in the natural world, really. You know, everything was formed by natural ways, you know, like in terms of the world and so on and so on. I mean, kind of what I mean to say is there was energy behind the formation of these things. And so things kind of, you know, you look at mountains, and mountains are very random in a sense, although they have a sense of directionality to them, probably from the energy that
Трохи
formed them,
напрягає
but
за це
they
велика
are
кількість порівнянь, але ну
really
типу,
kind
воно
of
класно, якісь
random. There's not like
асоціації зразу в
exactly 4
голові є,
mountains. Now,
типу,
of course, there are
для
instances
якоїсь
where there
бази,
are
я
exactly
думаю,
4
воно все
mountains or exactly 2
потрібно.
mountains, and those are usually tourist destinations because it is unusual, right? It doesn't seem natural. It seems unnatural, and so there's an appeal in that sort of thing. But when we're trying to make a natural-looking scene or a natural-looking character, we want to avoid literal parallels. You know, so we definitely don't ever want our arms or our limbs or clothing or anything to have literal parallels in it like this, right? And we definitely want to avoid mirroring. Why have both of the characters' arms down at the same angle? You know, why have the same pocket on both sides of a shirt? Etc., etc. I mean, you can really do that if you want to, but you have to ask yourself, does it feel too balanced? Does it feel too engineered? Or does it feel natural and cool, right? So we want to kind of change the arm direction, and instead of mirroring it, we have one arm kind of that way, and maybe the other arm's reaching out for something, or on, you know, it's on the hip or something like that. So, and this way we kind of achieve a nice natural feel. Okay, so this essentially is what parallels are. They're parallel, literal parallels, mirroring parallels, symbolic parallels, and the opposite to parallels really is asymmetry. We want asymmetry in everything that we're doing. And we'll look at asymmetrical shapes again later on. We have covered it a little bit. We'll look at it again later on, just to drive the point home of how much we need to avoid parallels in our work. Alright, that's the end of this lesson.
Ура, я вже починала засинати. Так, у нас наступне. Це як?
Welcome to the lesson on line weights. And in this lesson we're going to learn and understand more about why we need to line weight, why we should line weight, what line weights are, and where line weighting comes from, the concept of line weighting. So the first thing that I want to teach you about is something called atmospheric perspective. All right? And the concept is pretty straightforward. Basically, in the real world, air builds up between two objects, right? So there's just like a bunch of air between the two objects. And this happens to varying degrees. Obviously, when things are very close to us, there is air there, but the buildup is not much. And the further back things go, things tend to build up a little bit more. And when the air builds up, it tends to lighten the values, that is the brightness and the darkness of the object as it goes further back in the distance. And you see this when you're looking, you know, out on top of, when you're standing on top of a mountain, you're looking out on a city, and you see, you know, that the further back things go, you can kind of see that atmosphere, you can kind of see that air, and that perception of that air buildup helps you gauge the distance back that those objects are, because the further back they go, the lighter they get, And conversely, the closer things come to us, the darker they get, right? The more contrasting they get, and you could also say the more detailed they get, because they're kind of not being blurred out by the air in between the objects. All right. So in a nutshell, that is atmospheric perspective. Let's call this one close, this one far, and then just to kind of push the point, the far object would be somewhat lighter. All right. So the air kind of builds up. And that is what atmospheric perspective is. I see I forgot the C here. I'm just going to pop that in there. All right, atmospheric perspective. Closer objects are darker, further away objects are lighter, and we're going to use atmospheric perspective to inform how we come to understand line weighting, right? So line weighting isn't just something that we want to use in an inking stage. We want to try and implement line weighting all the time. So let's talk about line weights. Okay. Line weights or line weighting, right? So far we've learned about a few techniques for achieving a 3D look, right? And one of those techniques is drawing through, right? We want to draw through objects. We want to kind of imagine the other side of them. And the other technique that we've learned is overlapping lines, right? So even in 3D shapes or 2D shapes, when we start overlapping lines, we can achieve a sense of depth. And what line weighting does in many respects is it enhances the overlaps and introduces atmospheric perspective into the piece. So line weights really are degrees of weighting of the lines. So thicker lines come forward and thinner lines recede. Okay, so thicker lines come forward and thinner lines recede back into the distance. Pretty straightforward concept, I think, right? And so when we're drawing something in the foreground and we have an object in the background, what we can do, apart from the overlaps, apart from drawing through the forms to help us imagine the forms and the structures, is that we can weight the lines where they overlap on the foreground object, make them thicker, make them darker, to reinforce that this object is in front of the object behind it. What we can do is we can even darken just slightly the origin of the background points line to kind of hint at a little bit of a shadow that's happening there from the overlap. Okay. So the basic rule really is that if an object's in front, it should have slightly thicker lines than the object behind it. So for example, an arm crossing over a chest, even in a rough view like this, here's the arm crossing over the chest. This arm would be thicker lined and have a thicker weighting to it in general than the lines that it's covering. For example, there are some shirt lines here would be lighter, etc. Now another tip for this as well is to keep inner details for the smaller shapes, the details, things like shirts and buttons and creases and folds and things. Inner details, usually keep them at thinner lines and keep the bigger shapes, the bigger forms, having thicker, darker lines. But nevertheless, the fundamentals of line weights really are that foreground objects have darker, thicker lines and background objects have thinner, lighter lines. Now, I don't only just have this theory for you, I want to show you an example. This is an orc piece that I've done, and here you can see a multitude of varying line weights in the piece. Okay, so let me get a red pencil here and let's kind of deep dive the line weights a little bit. So here we can see inner details like those little tattoo marks, the little hairs on his chin, and the muscular lines of the sternocleidomastoids there, and many inner details have quite thin lines and also quite light lines, right? And then the bigger objects, such as his head, for example, which is overlapping his neck, you can see that there is a thicker line weighting applied just in general as these elements overlap, right? Overlap the objects behind them. Thinner lines in the background elements, thicker lines in the foreground elements. Another point as well is that foreground objects generally being darker means you can use darker lines in the foreground objects, and you can press lightly on your pencil to get thinner and lighter lines in the background objects. So here you can see how even though this line is thin over here, it kind of tapers off and goes pretty light as it comes to the edge here. I mean, that's not a general rule that things get lighter as they go right, but I'm just acknowledging that there is a kind of a more lightness here. And that's basically also really just implying detail to the viewer. This isn't a main focal point of the piece. Just let it be light, let it be thin. It's a little bit loose, but it's okay. And here, as we have the hand coming into the foreground, that's holding the sword over here, that the line weight is emphasized as we move around this particular form, right? And so its whole edge is kind of made thicker and made darker to help the viewer realize and understand that this is in front and the other objects are behind, to add depth. Line weighting also adds a very nice sense of character to the piece. It makes the piece look quite professional, makes the piece look quite slick. And so you want to always be trying to engineer line weights, stacking the theories on top of each other, stacking form with line overlaps, so drawing through, making sure you've got line overlaps, and then making sure your line weights are reading, that foreground objects have thicker lines, that background objects have thinner lines, and then remembering always also to draw loosely so that you get these nice tapers at the ends of your lines, and that lines are looking natural and they have directionality to them. Alright, that is the end of the lesson on line weights.
Так, скільки я там вже пройшла? Чи ще на 4 хвилини? Я думаю, поки що, напевно, зроблю паузу і продовжу якось іншим разом, тому що багато всього треба обдумати. І я вже починаю так розслаблятися, мені вже пішло все складно. Так що... Що думаєте, є сенс це пострімити, чи немає сенсу це стрімити? Окей, піду поки попрацюю. Та чого йти працювати, на що йти працювати? Я оце поки вас на гарний рейдик відправлю. А це, до речі, хто? Можна, щоб, типу, по темі відразу вас до Яри відправити, в неї якраз стрім почався. Звичайно, в неї куди цікавіші історії, ніж в мене, але... Зато не виходимо з флоу малювання. Так. Я йду теж працювати, а вам бажаю всім вдалого дня, обіймашечки. І думаю, що ввечері ще вийду на 1-2 серії дорами, яку ми вчора почали дивитися. Тому, якщо що, приходьте. А поки що, папульки, обіймашки, цілую, люблю вас. Рада була бачити всіх, хто прийшов. Дякую за вашу підтримку в ці нелегкі часи навчання.
Міаніма, хостить наш стрім. Дякую, привіт, як ваші справи? Привіт, Мія. За що отримати тайм-аут? За те, що ти говориш, що це дочка Сабзіро і Скорпіона. Да, утречка. Дякую. Дякую за хостик, Рейді. Дякую за фоллоу. Може погано, не мав на увазі нічого там кольори Сабзіро і Скорпіона на ній. Окей, я просто сьогодні зла, тому що я... Ну, коротше, я сьогодні в дворику гиркала на священника. Ну як гиркала? Я зробила йому зауваження. Це трошки так вийшло. Все, я мовчати. Що? Чись мені дякую. Я сварила священ... Слухай, в мене в під'їзді сусідньому живе православний священник. Щоразу, коли я йду двориком звідкилясь чи кудись, він постійно на мене пялиться. Не просто, типу, робить вигляд, що він дивиться в той бік, куди я йду, або звідкиля я йду. Він тупо пялиться. От стоїть і дивиться.